Chapter 445. She emphasized the word such an important thing, and spoke slowly. Lu Gongzan heard her words and glanced at her sleeve. The translucent jade slip was there before. So you should know that we are going to be allies. You are here with us and helping Li Yunxin. Are you afraid that you can't make up for the mistakes you have made before? Lu Gongzan's eyes flickered when he heard what she said. She seemed to have convinced him. His heart was in a mess. But since he suppressed the grief in his heart, there was also a surge of turbid air in his chest. So he lifted the silver wine pot and poured the remaining wine into his mouth. Then he threw the silver pot away and looked out of the window, but there was no focus. He seemed to be thinking about many things. On the other side, he picked up the chicken wings on the plate. He put them into his mouth and chewed slowly. He didn't even spit out the bones. Looking at him, it was like, even though he is disheartened and sad, he still wants to take care of his body, so that he can make a difference again. Exai and Shilio watched him eat patiently. When the food on the stone bed was finished, she asked again, "Have you thought about it?" Lu Gongzan was silent for a moment and let out a sigh. "If I work for you, what do I want to do?" The two kept mentioning the word we, but they never said which force they were from. But Exai and Shilio thought that Lu Gongzan should know. Li Yunxin told Lu Gongzan about what happened in Chengdu, the encounter with Mu Nanju, and the news that Mu Nanju claimed to be the art saint's Yubu. Mu Nanju had the intention to recruit him for a long time, and now he said something like forming an alliance. Lu Laodao was not stupid. On the contrary, he was very smart. He must have thought of it. So she smiled slightly. "There is one thing to do first. I mean, do you know why Li Yunxin dared to come to Yunshan this time? Because he has a way out?" Lu Gongzan was stunned at first, then he frowned. "What do you mean?" "Oh, you think I know about him?" He laughed again. "Alas. He has already said such words to me and sent such poems to me. If I knew what his escape route was, would I still do so?" Exai and Shilio thought for a moment and suddenly tilted her head to look at him. "If you really don't know, why did he send you this painting?" Lu Gongzan's brows furrowed even more tightly. His eyes slowly became hesitant. "The painting was originally in your hands. I haven't even touched it. Why are you asking me?" Exai and Shilio stopped talking. Because she had a thought in her mind. She had suspected that Li Yunxin might want to borrow her hand to pass some information to Lu Gongzan. But when she came here and saw Lu Gongzan's performance, she couldn't see any flaws. Everything seemed to come from his heart. Maybe there was really no flaw. So this Li Yunxin really just told this Laodao the result? Is he really such a sentimental person? She should not believe this conclusion. She should believe that all the previous actions of Li Yunxin were fake, and he had ulterior motives. She should force herself to find a way to prove that what he said in the forest was a lie, and that Lu Gongzan was actually plotting something with Li Yunxin. But there was another thought in her mind that wanted her to believe that Li Yunxin was indeed a sentimental person. His previous coldness was just an armor to cover his soft heart. Now, she did see and touch the soft side of Li Yunxin. And this Lu Gongzan was indeed abandoned by Li Yunxin. This painting, which was filled with intense emotions, was his final explanation to him. She was struggling between reason and emotion. Usually, reason would be the overwhelming advantage, but today, reason kept retreating. What the hell was going on? What was wrong with her? She suddenly felt an inexplicable anger in her heart. Because of that painting, this Lu Gongzan actually got such affection from that person. Originally, he didn't trust anyone, but he trusted this old Taoist with deep feelings and deep feelings. Even now he still showed such intense emotions. This was, Exai and Shilio took a deep breath and calmed down. Then she looked at Lu Gongzan. "So, you really don't know? Humph, he was really sentimental to you. Other people kill them just because they want to kill them, but they let them go just because they want to let them go. Yet they made this painting for you." The inexplicable anger in her heart was revealed through her words. The doubt in Lu Gongzan's eyes became more serious. "What are you trying to say?" Then he frowned. "Who are you? You want me to do things for you. Who are you?" Exai and Shilio suddenly sneered. Her previous soft and slow tone was gone. "Do things for you? I asked you that because I thought you knew something. Now that you don't know anything, what's the use of keeping you?" She had never shown such a tone and expression in front of Li Yunxin. In fact, she had never shown it in front of others. But tonight, for some reason, there was a turbid feeling in her heart that made her become sharp and violent. But if one thought about it carefully, this feeling had been there for a few hours. At that time, Lu Gongzan was stunned for a while. Then he suddenly smiled. But his smile didn't show any sadness or anger, or any other emotion. So you are not a member of Mu Nanju? He stared at Exan Shilio, gritting his teeth. What you said to me before was just a lie. Hey, do you think a person like me is worthy of your noble cultivator's schemes? Exan Shilio sneered. Of course not. After saying this, she turned around and left without hesitation. But when she walked to the door, Lu Gongzan suddenly shouted, Give me the painting. Her body stilled, but she didn't turn her head. That painting. Do you think you are worthy of it? She didn't know if she had revealed too much emotion. Or maybe Lu Gongzan was very smart. When he heard what she said, Lao Dao was stunned at first, and then he understood. He gritted his teeth and sneered. Oh, it seems that you have fallen in love with him. Bah! He spat on the ground again and returned her words back to her. Do you think you're worthy of someone like Brother Exan? Exan Shilio was silent for a moment. Suddenly, she turned half of her face and looked at Lu Gongzan. Half of her face was very beautiful under the moonlight and the lights in the room. But the words that came out of her mouth had nothing to do with the word beauty. Okay, in that case, I'll tell you one more thing. Exan Shilio's voice became soft again, but it was used to describe the word slippery in the word poisonous snake. 4 hours ago, I went to the stone room where the chicken was imprisoned. After saying this, she paused and suddenly changed the topic. But what if I love him? So what if I can't bear to see him treat others well? Not only that, he will also fall in love with me. He has been in our plan for a long time. Then she laughed. Lu Gongzan, think about it. What did you eat just now? With this laughter, she suddenly spread her arms. The lights in the stone room and the paper on the door and window all disappeared. The strong wind in the sky whistled and surged in once again, causing her robe sleeves to flutter in the wind. Lu Gongzan was stunned first, and then he looked at the ebony plate next to him. He tilted his body, as if he was blown over by the strong wind. He used his left hand to support himself on the bed, and shouted in grief and indignation. Which? Exan Shilio stopped laughing. She raised her hand to tidy her hair, looked at Lu Gongzan calmly, and went into the night sky. So, half an hour later, only then did Lu Gongzan let out a sigh of relief amidst the fierce wind. He slowly supported his body with his left arm, and sat cross-legged on the stone bed again. He looked as if he wanted to vomit. When he ate the braised chicken wings just now, they were indeed very delicious. It was soft and tender, and the cooking skills were good. It melted in his mouth and melted his bones. When it fell into his stomach, a stream of spiritual aura spread out and repaired his dried organs and meridians. Without this thing, he didn't know how long he could last. He thought it was a special spiritual item from Mount Yunshan. Thinking of this, his stomach churned again, but he clenched his teeth and swallowed it. Because he knew one more thing. The 4 lines on the painting were the first 4 lines. Then, there were the last 4 lines. The grass is wet from the drizzle. The flowers are ready to move. The spring wind is cold. What's the matter of the world? It's better to sleep and eat. The full name of the poem was Drinking Wine and Pay D. Brother Exan loved this poem, and had recited it 3 times. Lu Gongzan thought the poem was wonderful, so he wrote it down. Later, he couldn't help but ask Brother Exan the name of the poem. Li Yunxin thought for a while, and said it was Drinking Wine and Pay D. Lu Laodao couldn't help but ask who Pei Di was. Li Yunxin was in a good mood that day, so he said, he's a good friend of the author, a friend of life and death, and he saved the author's life. How could the old Taoist not know that the author, that Brother Exan was referring to, was himself? Brother Exan would occasionally recite a few lines of poetry. There was a righteous one like living and dying for the benefit of the country. How can I avoid it because of misfortune or fortune? There was also a romantic and gentle one like, the mountains are piled up in the rain at dawn. The grass rustles with the fragrance of musk in the spring wind. Whenever Lu Laodao asked, he would always say, copying other people's poems. But where did he get so many exquisite poems for him to copy? Brother Xian had some warmth in his heart, but it was hard to show it. That was probably why he pretended to be someone else, and didn't let others know that he could write so many emotions in his poems. But tonight, he only wrote the first 4 lines. He knew that he knew the last 4 lines. He compared himself to Pei Di. How could the demoness know the last 4 lines? And how could she know about Brother Xian's past? The painting didn't tell him to cut in half, or whitehead pressing sword. Instead, it told him to be careful. Even if it was an old friend, he had to be careful not to mention the demoness. He immediately put on an act. Brother Xian taught him the heart study. How could the demoness see through it? And the overflowing resentment and murderous aura in the painting must be Brother Xian's other emotions to confuse the demoness. It wasn't targeted at him. But how could the demoness distinguish between them? And now, he was told to do the same as the last 4 lines. To lie down and have a good meal to recuperate. Although the flower branches are ready to move, the cold spring wind told him to wait for the right time. Lu Gongzan took another deep breath. The piercingly cold wind almost frostbitten his lungs. But his heart warmed up. Pheasant, pheasant. He suppressed the churning in his stomach, gritted his teeth and recited. His voice disappeared in the wind. I hope you only lost an arm and didn't lose your life. Old Lu, this old bag of bones will borrow your arm to linger on for a few more days. Brother Xian will avenge you and them. He recited it a few times and was silent for a while. Then, he slowly raised his left hand and pressed on his festering right arm. Brother Xian, you have to hurry up. Chapter 446. Xian Shilio gently jumped down from the bird's back in the night and landed on the square in front of the dome hall. The entire square was paved with white jade, but it wasn't pieced together. The word whole meant that this wide square was just a piece of white marble. The majestic palace on the floating mountain was brightly lit at this moment. The space outside the floating mountain that forbade supernatural powers was removed here. The light from the talismans continued day and night, even though there were only 2 people living here all year round. She walked through the square and arrived at the door of the dome hall after half an hour. She reached out and pushed the door open. She saw Su Yusong and Zhuomuja changing clothes in the hall. The ground of this wide palace was smooth black jade. There were hundreds of talisman light sources on the dome. The light was reflected on the black ground. It looked like someone had cut out the night sky full of stars and spread it on the ground. There was a row of cabinets deep in the palace. The cabinets occupied an entire wall and reached the dome. Countless small doors were lined up on it. It looked like there were thousands of wooden lattices that were taller than a person. Su Yusong and Zhuomuja changed clothes on a soft couch in front of the cabinet. Zhuomuja was dressed. Tonight, she changed into the appearance of a young woman. Her face wasn't very beautiful, but she had delicate features. She looked like a little girl next door. Su Yusong was only half dressed. Her body was purely made of muscles and blood vessels. It was red and scary. She looked like she had been skinned. It was very similar to how Ling Kongzi looked when the 6 Desires Tribulation body was reconstructed in Li Yunxin's Dragon Palace. He was half dressed in human skin, but didn't continue. She seemed to have reached a key point with Zhuomuja and stopped. Xian Shilio let out a soft ah, and was about to leave. Su Yusong saw her and waved to her, indicating that it was okay. She turned and closed the door. She stepped on the stars and approached them. When she got closer, she heard what was being said. In fact, it wasn't a very important matter. It was nothing more than the movements of the Black Tower and the coalition forces outside the Black Tower. Many innocent mortal soldiers had been brutally slaughtered in the previous battle. This matter had already gradually spread. The morale of the Allied army was wavering, and the emperors of the various countries also carefully expressed their dissatisfaction. However, the thoughts of these mortals were not worth caring about at the moment. It was just a minor ailment. After saying this, Su Yusong put the other half of his body in. The human skin's head was originally flat and flat. Now that he was propped up, his face gradually filled out. Zhuomuja walked behind him and helped him comb his hair. He looked at the corner of his eyes and sighed lightly. 2 more lines. I like your outfit the most. Su Yusung had also changed into a young man tonight, with red lips and white teeth. Unfortunately, there were indeed wrinkles at the corners of his eyes. After he was done, he raised his hand and stroked it. He smiled bitterly. It's just 2 Dao patterns. Mortals had wrinkles while they were still alive. When I'm free, I feel that this set of clothes is very loose. You don't have to change it for me. Zhuomuja sighed again. How could it be so easy to exchange? I've seen all the young people on the mountain this year. None of them look like you. This set of clothes is the most similar, and I'm not willing to change it. As he said this, he had already combed Su Yusung's hair. Then he turned to look at Exai and Shilio. How is junior sister? Exai and Shilio originally listened to the two of them chatting leisurely with a smile. Others were not like her, who could often see such a leisurely and warm scene. Only when she was asked did she calm down. Lu Gongzan doesn't know anything. Oh, Zhuomuja responded. Then he took a robe from the clothes rack next to him and helped Su Yusung put it on, just like a husband and wife. Su Yusung looked up at her while tying the belt of his shirt. What about the translucent jade slip? Exai and Shilio immediately reached into her sleeve and took out the translucent jade slip. Give him to me. Zhuomuja and Su Yusung were slightly stunned and looked at each other. Then Zhuomuja reached out to take it and smiled. Little girl, you really have some tricks. With this praise, Exai and Shilio raised her eyebrows. She didn't look like a junior sister talking to senior brother or senior sister, but like talking to her parents who loved her very much. He gave it to me when he came. I guess he wants to use it to test whether I'm the three-faced spy or not. If I am, I definitely won't give this translucent jade slip to those people in Munanju. Hearing her words, Zhuomuja was stunned. Then he threw the translucent jade slip back to her. Since he wants to test you, why take it out now? You keep it. If he asks, just say it's not the right time to give it to that Taoist Qingshui. Exai and Shilio pouted. Of course I know this. But I don't want to hold it anymore. Don't senior brother and senior sister also want this thing? Since it's already in my hands, I'm not afraid that Li Yunxin will see through me. Senior brother and senior sister. After saying this, she took a step forward and grabbed Su Yusung's arm with her left hand and Zhuomuja's arm with her right hand. She shook her arms like a spoiled child. Senior brother and senior sister, let's quickly kill Li Yunxin. At this time, Su Yusung had put on his outer robe. The belt of his robe was not fastened and was loosely open. He looked very relaxed. But his arm was swayed by Exai and Shilio, and half of his robe fell off. But he didn't get angry. Instead he laughed. Why do you want to kill him? To make you angry. Exai and Shilio pouted again. I don't want to play anymore. Anyway, you want to kill him. Didn't senior brother and senior sister say that Li Yunxin has a good aptitude and is smart, so he's the best choice to become a wandering soul? It's not easy to lure Yunshan here. I'm afraid that he'll run away. Zhuomuja slowly pushed her hand away. Compared to Su Yusung, he was more like a strict mother. He stared at Exai and Shilio for a while until she pursed her lips and blinked her eyes. Then he shook his head and said to Su Yusung, this little girl has been bewitched by Li Yunxin. Exai and Shilio hurriedly said, no. Su Yusung only smiled and didn't say anything. Zhuomuja frowned and looked at her. I asked you to bewitch him and get information from him. But now you've sent yourself to kill him. Do you think I don't know what you're thinking about? You want to kill him and become a wandering soul. You want to stay with him forever, don't you? Exai and Shilio bit her lip and looked at Su Yusung. But he didn't say anything. He looked like a kind father who didn't want to get involved in the quarrel between the mother and daughter. Then she cried. What if I am? You also said that Li Yunxin is not a big deal. Then why didn't you give him to me? You two are, but I'm the only one who is lonely and has no one to love or care for me. What kind of people are there on Yunshan? The Taoist priests and swordsmen are bored to death, and the mortals are stupid to death. Where can I find people to talk to? Now there's a Li Yunxin, and you asked me to provoke him. As she spoke, her eyes turned red. She looked like she was about to cry. She was already pretty. Now that she showed a wronged expression, it was even more lovable. Seeing her like this, Zhuomuja couldn't keep a straight face anymore. He could only sigh again, walk over and pull Xan Shilio into his arms, pressing her face against his chest. The little girl pretended to struggle a few times, and then lay in his arms, moaning with grievance. Zhuomuja said softly, "If you like someone else, you don't need to say it's a Taoist priest or a swordsman. Even if it's the sect leader of those sects, the sect leader of the heavens, or the senior brothers and sisters, we'll kill them and use them to love you. But this Li Yunxin, although it doesn't matter if it's him alone, he has a lot of connections. For example, he has connections with the people from Nanmuju, and with the demons. Also, he knows where the sword saint of the previous generation is. And maybe he even knows where the two sages of this generation are. Because of these, it's not good to kill him directly. It's also because he knows how to protect his life, and used many connections to cover himself. That's why we're happy to use him, and drag several factions into this. That way they'll all be exposed. Moreover, you also know that you snuck into Nanmuju. The owner of Nanmuju Taoist Qingshui has a high opinion of this Li Yunxin. We still haven't figured out why such a heaven-defying person would favor this little Li Yunxin. All the more we can't, just kill him. So for now we'll lock him up in Yunshan first. We'll see if the people from Nanmuju can't sit still, and come looking for him. Then, we'll be able to catch all the remaining art saint in one fell swoop. We'll also see if he came to Yunshan to do something for the sword saint of the previous generation." At this point, she raised her hand and gently stroked Xan Shilio's hair. Senior martial brother and senior martial sister are bent on finding the method to reconstruct the physical body of the previous generation. Since Li Yunxin is acquainted with the sword saint, he might know the method from her. Once we get our hands on this secret, we don't need to be wandering souls anymore, and we'll be able to have our own bodies. By then, it'll be easy for you to find anyone you want, right? After her careful guidance, Xan Shilio bit her lips. "But you've already reconstructed your bodies." Zhuomuja glanced at Su Yusong. Su Yusong smiled. "We borrowed the physical bodies of the book saint and the sword saint, so they're not considered our own." The truly brilliant technique was the 6 desires tribulation body technique. I've only heard that Su Yusong created this method, but no one has ever seen it. Sigh, don't we wandering souls just want our own bodies? When Xan Shilio came in, she saw Su Yusong's bloody body piercing through the human skin. It was the body he had borrowed, the physical body of the book saint. However, even if it was a method that the two of them were not satisfied with, only the two of them among the wandering souls knew about it. She didn't know much about it, so she only heard half of it. But she already knew. These two did not agree to kill Li Yunxin immediately. They were concerned about what forces Li Yunxin could attract. And they were also concerned about the method that Li Yunxin might know to create the 6 desires tribulation. So she gritted her teeth again, and struggled out of Zhuomuja's arms. After being annoyed for a while, she sighed and said, "Okay then." She said this unhappily, and suddenly rolled her eyes. "Then, I won't kill him for the time being. But senior martial brother and senior martial sister have to promise me something else." Zhuomuja also sighed with a smile. "You little girl, what are you talking about now? Every one of them is a matter of tens or hundreds of thousands of lives. How can I promise you casually?" Su Yusong waved his hand. "Okay, I'll listen to you for the time being. If it's not important, I'll promise you," Xan Shilio hurriedly said. "Then, tell me what the treasure that can make me the master of the demons is. When we came here, Li Yunxin said that the demons are coveting the treasure on Mount Yunshan. But why don't I know about it? Senior martial brother and senior martial sister, tell me, and I'll take it to coax him." Hearing her words, Su Yusong and Zhuomuja didn't immediately agree, nor did they immediately object. Instead, they looked at each other and remained silent for a while. "How can there be such a thing?" Su Yusong laughed. "Only those who are obsessed with the legends of the secular world will believe that you can immediately dominate the world with a divine object or a secret manual. If there is such a thing on Mount Yunshan, why didn't the master of the demons ask you to be it?" As he said, he poked Xan Shilio's sharp nose full of affection. Xan Shilio's eyes widened. But Li Yunxin said that Long Da and Long Air both know that there is such a thing on Mount Yunshan. This time, they want to come here partly because of that thing. How can it be something that they are thinking about be a lie? Ah, Li Yunxin lied to me. It's not that Li Yunxin lied to you. Su Yusong shook his head. Alas, there is such a saying. You also know that more than 1,000 years ago, the world was in a mess. The three sages fought with each other, and we also exerted our strength. At that time, there was a rumor that there was a treasure on Mount Yunshan. If you get it and understand it, you can have the ability to shock the demons. You see, you have to understand it first, and then you can shock the demons. But later, it was said that if you get it, you can become the master of the demons. Su Yusong sat on the soft couch, raised his hand, and gently massaged his legs. Later, your senior martial sister and I became the sages. At first, we also thought it was true, so we searched carefully on this mountain. But after searching for so long, we still couldn't find it. Now on Mount Yunshan, Daotong and Kenzo, which one of them we don't know. And because we know that it doesn't exist. As for Long Da and Long Air attacking Mount Yunshan, they should have other plans. It's just that we took this matter out and let it spread secretly, so that we can gather the hearts of the demons. It's funny that Li Yunxin actually believed it. What he said was reasonable, so Exa and Shilio could only pout resentfully. This won't do, that won't do. Zhuomuja was about to say a few more words of comfort, but her eyeballs rolled again. This time Zhuomuja saw it. He was stunned at first, then he laughed and looked at Su Yusong. Just wait and see. This sly girl came this time with a few hidden ideas in her heart. If she doesn't get one tonight, she will not give up. I don't know what's so good about that Li Yunxin that he is so obsessed. Then he looked at Exai and Shilio. Say it, what ideas do you have? Exai and Shilio giggled. Senior brother and sister, you can't refuse what I said. You can't kill Li Yunxin, and you don't know what treasures he has. Then, can you ask someone to catch Bai Yunxin and Hong Yangzi for me? Su Yusong laughed. Why do you want to catch those two? Exai and Shilio snorted. Li Yunxin said that he liked them before. I want to see what exactly he likes about them. Catch them, and I'll slowly ask them, play with them. That's all. Hee. Then Bai Yunxin will return to her original form, and become my mount. She will definitely be more powerful than my red crown crane. As for Hong Nyangzi, she's useless. Just throw her away. Zhuomuja frowned. Then Bai Yunxin and Hong Nyangzi. Bai Yunxin is the adopted daughter of the Golden Rock King. Why bother to provoke her? If the Golden Rock breaks free from the seal in the future, won't it be troublesome? Hearing this, Exa and Shilio immediately bit her lip. Okay. I can't kill her. I don't know about her, and I can't catch her. Li Yunxin is more precious than me, and so is Bai Yunxin. Only I'm the most despised one. My senior brother and sister are sages, but they're afraid of his adopted daughter because of a big demon. As she spoke, tears fell down like pearls from a broken necklace. This time she really cried. Su Muja glanced at Su Yusong. The latter thought for a while, sighed and waved his hand. Sword Saint also sighed. Okay. Quickly keep your pearls. My senior brother and sister can't afford to compensate you for them. I'll listen to you. Ask a few people to catch them. If they can catch them, I'll give them to you. If they can't catch them, don't make trouble anymore. Exai and Shilio immediately smiled through her tears. Then asked Ku Chanzi to catch them. Zhuomuja frowned again. Ku Chanzi. She turned to look at Su Yusong. Now he's the chief of the Lengyi Cave Heaven. He's in charge of the Black Tower. Why do you want him to go? Exai and Shilio snorted. At night, he made things difficult for me in front of Li Yunxin. I want him to go. Once the Golden Rock King escapes, he'll be the first to be killed. The two sages laughed because of her little temper and thoughts. Fine. I'll just ask him to go. Is there anything else? Exa and Shilio's anger turned into a smile. Hee. Senior brother and sister, I'll go now. The two seemed to be used to her behavior. They waved their hands again. Go. Exa and Shilio turned and ran out like a gust of wind. When she closed the door and her footsteps disappeared, after a dozen breaths, Su Yusong sighed. She's going to be spoiled. Zhuomuja also sighed. How can I not know? But there's no one else in the world who is like Yiqiong like her. Alas, it's also an obsession. It's also a resentment. I only hope that we can cultivate the 6 desires tribulation body soon. When we don't need to rely on any obsession to survive in the world, then we can be considered as truly human again. Su Yusong patted her hand. All right. That day will come. Then he frowned slightly. From the looks of it, this Li Yunxin is also a bit strange. Yiqiong, Xian Shilio is such a clever girl. But she's been charmed by him in just one day. Let's give him a few more days, and see if he can draw out anything. If he really can't be drawn out, then he'll be refined into a wandering soul. Shilio also has something to play with. Alas, you can make the decisions on these matters. Recently, I've been worrying about those elders. Zhuomuja sat down beside him and leaned against his chest. I'm thinking, in the past they told us. Thus, on such a night, the two of them began to talk in the empty hall. Chapter 447. When we were in Yunshan, people like me were not worthy of your attention. Grandmother Bean walked on the rugged mountain road, but her steps were light. Even though the trees on both sides of the road cast dense shadows on the road, it did not hinder her from walking like the wind. However, Lu Ling, who was walking behind her, was having a hard time. He had to struggle to catch his breath to keep up with her pace. At that time, you must not have known that the so-called Daotong and Kenzo were actually our people. The Freemasons. She stopped at the top of the mountain and looked ahead. In front of them was Wei River. This place was already more than 30 miles away from the city of Wei. In the valley beside Wei River, at the foot of this hill, there was a medium-sized village. This village was called Yao Village. You have never heard of these 3 words before. But now that you want to work for us, you must do your best. Seeing the destination, Grandmother Bean sighed with relief and turned to look at Lu Ling behind her. If we can control the Daotong and Kenzo, we can naturally do more things. You want to be a wandering soul, regain your cultivation, and settle old scores with Li Yunxin? This is a good thing. Wandering soul, without a heart of obsession. How can you be a wandering soul? She paused. Then she looked at the silent Lu Ling. But you must first make a contribution to get the opportunity to advance. For example, right now, her tone became serious. You and I have been in the city of Wei for 7 days. And we still haven't figured out how Li Yunxin died and came back to life that day. If you hide something, and it is revealed later, not to mention wandering soul, even the opportunity to be a remnant soul will be gone. Lu Ling moved his lips, dry and even chapped, and said in a low voice, I did not hide anything. Grandmother Bean smiled coldly. Then think about it. During the days when you were with Li Yunxin, did he really not mention the word 6 desires tribulation? Not even half a word. Lu Ling bit his lips. No. If there is, I'll definitely remember. Humph. Grandmother Bean snorted noncommittally. All of a sudden, he reached out and picked up Lu Ling. With a leap, he landed at the foot of the mountain like a large bird. This was the west side of Yao Village, the village entrance. There were 2 large and lush locust trees. Even though it was autumn, and the leaves had turned yellow, they were still lush and yellow. There was a small temple hidden among the trees. 1 hall, 1 courtyard, and 2 rooms. The lights had already been extinguished, and the village was extremely quiet. Firstly, it was the middle of the night. Secondly, most of the people in Yao Village had fled. Only the old and the weak were left behind. Who would be willing to stay in the city of Wei after such a catastrophe? Because of this, someone who used to live in Yao Village once mentioned such an incident. It was said that several months ago, on the night of thunder and fire on the mountain outside the city of Wei, Taoist Hong Song, the temple attendant of the Wei River Dragon King Temple in the village, saw a strange thing. A golden deity walked down from the picture scroll worshipped in the temple and showed his divinity. Probably, the Wei River Dragon King knew that the village was in trouble, so he went to protect the people. This incident eventually came to Grandmother Bean's ears. Now they were standing outside the temple of the Dragon King, where the divinity of the Wei River Dragon King once showed his divinity. After quietly observing for a while, they landed in the courtyard with a leap. The courtyard was full of weeds, but now they were all lying on the ground, with a layer of white frost on them. But it seemed that the weeds had not been taken care of in recent months, so it just reached the ankles. In fact, it could be seen that this temple used to have a lot of incense. Although the courtyard was desolate, the temple didn't show much dilapidation at the moment. He stood silently in the darkness like a ferocious beast. Grandmother Bean walked to the door of the temple. Lu Ling followed her, and the two halberds on his back collided. The sound was especially obvious in the quiet night. Then they heard a sound from the wing room. First a clang, as if something fell on the ground. Then a man's voice, hoarse and muddy. "There's nothing left to take." His breath was weak, as if he had been sick for a long time. Grandmother Bean turned a deaf ear to him. She walked to the door of the temple and pushed it open. A cloud of dust fell from the door. Then she pointed in the void with her finger, and a soft light lit up, illuminating the inside of the temple. There was indeed a painting, but there was no Reiki on it, so it was just a painting. In the painting, there was a deity in golden armor, and a dragon lady serving a sword. On the incense table, there was a memorial tablet, Supreme Venerable, Holy and Mysterious Lingbao Crown Prince Jiawan. Grandmother Bean frowned and stared at the painting for a long time. The painting was very good, but it was just an ordinary painting. There was no spiritual energy in it. It didn't match the story in the legend. But the problem was that this was not the only legend she heard around the city of Wei. Besides the Dragon King Temple in the Yao village, the other temples in the surrounding villages and towns all had the same legend. Roughly counting, she had heard about 8 or 9 versions of the story. Other factors in the story might be different, but there were only 2 things that were consistent. First, the time when the miracle appeared. It almost happened on the same night, at the same time. Second, the appearance of the deity and the miracle was very similar. It couldn't be those temple attendants spreading the rumor. Those rogue Taoists had low levels of cultivation, so they inadvertently said many details. For a cultivator like Grandmother Bean, only experts would know. If they could make up such a lie, why would they work as temple attendant in this place? At this moment, they heard the door of the wing room open. Grandmother Bean and Lu Ling stood at the door of the hall, silently turning their heads. A man wearing a torn and dirty shirt stumbled out, holding a wooden stick in his hand. His hair was messy, and his beard was unkempt. But it could be seen that his hair was in a Taoist bun. He must be the temple attendant of the Dragon King Temple in the Yao village, Hongsong. But after a few steps, he tripped on the weeds on the ground. He stumbled a few times before stabilizing himself, and then walked over. It was a late autumn night, and they were in the mountains, so the weather was actually very cold. The man was indeed shivering, as if he was about to freeze to death. But he looked very persistent. While walking, he murmured, "There's nothing to take. How dare you?" The Dragon King showed his divinity here, showed his divinity. Finally, he walked to the door, waving his stick randomly, knocking on the door. But he didn't hit Grandmother Bean. He reached out his hand to feel the door frame, and went inside again. He walked to the incense table, touched the painting, and then calmed down a little. He hugged the stick in his arms and continued to murmur, "How dare you? How dare you?" He was blind. Grandmother Bean's gaze followed him. She stared at him for a while, walked over, and reached out her hand, pulling him up by his collar, and brought him in front of her. Taoist Hongsong was weak, unable to speak, and his hands and feet flailed wildly. Grandmother Bean stared at his eyes, softly said, "Oh," and threw him to the ground. Then she said, "So you were born with eyes." Taoist Hongsong was stunned, as if he didn't expect the visitor to be a woman. After a while he slowly stepped back, until the incense table pressed against his back. "Queen, there are no more families in this village. I don't have anything valuable here. Let's go somewhere else. I heard that the Lord of God showed his divinity in your temple. Is that true?" Grandmother Bean's tone was neither fast nor slow. As usual, she was very calm and collected. Taoist Hongsong was stunned again. He thought she was here to steal. Ever since he became blind, people often came. At first, they stole the gold and silver candlesticks, golden lamps and silver lamps. Then the bronze wares were not spared. In the end, even the iron wares were gone. Now that most of the people in the village had left, the number of thieves had lessened. But the one who came tonight. Who are you? At this time, he remembered the woman's words. So you were born with eyes. But she still didn't reply. She just continued. Born with eyes is not a good thing for cultivators and mortals. But it is a good thing for a low-level rogue Taoist like you. You can see ghosts. And you are more sensitive to spiritual energy than ordinary people. It is easy to get started. But once you get started, you don't have a proper method. And your mind is easily disturbed by spirits and ghosts. It is even more difficult to improve. She paused. Your eyes were blinded after you saw the Lord of God show his divinity that night, right? Her words and tone caused Taoist Hong Song's eyes to widen. He could already tell that this woman was not an ordinary person. For a moment, he didn't know what to say, and could only nod blankly. That night of 100 ghosts. There were more than 100 ghosts. There were hundreds of thousands, millions of ghosts. Your eyes are more sensitive than ordinary people. Being hit by so much ghost chi is like seeing 100 suns in a normal person's eyes. How can you not be blind? It's just that meeting me tonight can be considered fate. Let me ask you, do you want to regain your sight? Taoist Hong Song opened his mouth and turned his head in a daze. But the next moment, he immediately shouted, Yes, yes. Immortal, please save me. As he said that, he prostrated on the ground and began to kowtow. Then first tell me about the Lord of God show his divinity in your temple. Then tell me about the other temples where the divinity showed his divinity. Did you collude to make it up? Or did it really happen? Nearly an hour later, being grandma frowned. Taoist Hong Song had indeed told her everything he knew, although there were some embellishments and some words that were used to curry favor. In general, they were correct. In fact, she had slowly sorted out a line in her mind. Lu Ling arrived in the city of Wei, and Li Yunxin went to Cheonghua building for a banquet. After the banquet, the temple attendants from the temples near the city of Wei gathered together and presented his paintings to them. At that time, the paintings had spiritual power. Boldly speculating, he must have attached his own breath to the paintings and absorbed the wishes of the villagers. To a human, this was a suicidal act. But it meant he already had the will to die at that time. Could it be that he had already obtained the method to cultivate the 6 desires tribulation body? Then, a few days before death and rebirth, he wandered on the streets of the city of Wei. He gave away some paintings and carved talismans everywhere in the city. Being grandma tried those talismans one by one. Chapter 448. There were many cultivators from Daotong and Kinzo who were more powerful than her. However, none of them could understand the meaning of Li Yunxin's methods as deeply as she did, because she was one of the Taoist painters on Yunshan. With the power of the transcendent state, it was impossible for him to do what Li Yunxin did. However, he could still follow the things he left behind. So she knew, Li Yunxin set up a big array. Using the city of Wei as a scroll, he drew all the meridians and acupoints in his body. Tonight, after understanding what Taoist Hong Song said, Ning Ke also knew his intention. To use the power of incense and wishes as a guide to draw the vitality of hundreds of thousands of people in the city of Wei, and fill it all into the huge picture scroll. But then what? Then it was the key, the most important thing, the core of everything. But Dopa felt that this was all she could do. Only Li Yunxin knew what was going to happen next. She thought for a while and sighed softly. Taoist Hong Song stared blankly and didn't dare to make a sound. Now that he heard her sigh, he cautiously asked, Immortal Elder? Little Taoist's eyes. Dopa was silent for a moment and looked at him. She suddenly opened her mouth and began to recite at a fast speed. What she recited was a formula that was difficult for ordinary people to understand. She recited dozens of sentences in one breath. Taoist Hong Song was stunned for a moment, and then quickly propped himself up. He pricked up his ears like a beast, afraid to miss a word. After 3 breaths, Dopa stopped. She had recited 64 sentences. Then she said, These 64 sentences come from a skill called water cloud force. If you can remember most of it, have good understanding and good aptitude, you can regain your sight in a few months. But if you can't remember it and practice it incorrectly, there is nothing you can do. Take care of yourself. She turned around and left. Lu Ling hurried to catch up. The expression on Hong Song's face changed again and again, as if he really wanted to ask something, to express his gratitude. But he was afraid that if he said something else, he would forget everything that was still in his mind. Thereupon he only sat on the ground, not daring to move. After a quarter of an hour, Dopa finally stopped. At this time, the two of them returned to the small mountain where they came from. At the foot of the hill was a road that went north across the Wei River. If they continued northwest, they would be in the direction of the Yi Kingdom. She took another look at the pitch-black Yao family village and took out a purple talisman from her sleeve. With a pinch of his fingers, he ignited it without hesitation. Soon, a swaying shadow appeared in front of him. 2 breaths later, a man and a woman appeared in the painting. Although the image was blurry, he could still make out the features of the person. It seemed to be a young man. The man sat on the soft couch, and the woman leaned against him. Being grandmother's face was expressionless. He bowed slightly and said, "Senior apprentice brother, senior apprentice sister. I've already found something. Speak." The voice in the light was somewhat ethereal. Thus, she spoke of the line in her heart in simple words. In the end, he hesitated for a moment and said, "In my opinion, Li Yunxin's so-called retreat is probably this move. If he really has the method of the 6 desires tribulation body, or some other means, then he can die again. This can explain why he has been so arrogant and crazy recently. If he uses the same method to die again and again, then many people will think that he is really dead. Then he can secretly wait for an opportunity and accumulate his strength. However, if he wants to use the same trick again, he must make some arrangements in advance, just like in the city of Wei." Being grandmother was silent for a while and said in a low voice, "I have thought about it, and I think of a very suspicious thing." The person in the light said again, "What is it?" Li Yunxin was struck by lightning on the Lord Dongting mountain. Later, he was chased to the wild forest and killed Cheng Kongzi in the forest. Then, he disappeared without a trace in the wilderness for a few days. He was already in the state of truth at that time. From the place where Cheng Kongzi was killed to Changji town, he needed at most 1 day. So what was he doing in the remaining days? The wild forest is very large. There are not only countless living creatures, but also many demons. Now that Black Bai Yanjun is living in seclusion, no one can collect the souls of the dead. But according to the information I found these days, in the wild forest after the fire disaster, the number of souls that appeared around the wild forest was very small. Then where did the souls that were missing go? More than hundreds of thousands of them. She paused after saying this. The man and woman in the light also remained silent for a while. They said something, as if they were exchanging opinions. Then the man's voice came. "Tell me your opinion." Being grandmother took a deep breath. "In my opinion, Li Yunxin is indeed using the same trick. He may be in the wild forest, using the method of the city of Wei, and set up a big formation. But this time the formation is bigger. It is dozens or even hundreds of times bigger than the formation of the city of Wei. With the whole wild forest as the background, it stretches across the Qing Kingdom and the Yi Kingdom. And the souls that disappeared may have been turned into resentment. Just like how he needs the power of faith in the temples around the city of Wei to trigger the yang qi of hundreds of thousands of people in the city of Wei, the resentment that he transformed from hundreds of thousands of souls is also used as the primer of the big formation." He seemed to be surprised by her conclusion. The man in the light, Su Yusong, was stunned for a while. Then he said, "According to your understanding of painting, is it feasible for him to do this?" After a while Being grandmother sighed. But this sigh was not because of pity, nor because of sadness, but more like she was subdued by some kind of terrible, shocking, and incomparably grand method. "With my cultivation, it is impossible to do this." She paused. "But that Li Yunxin can no longer be described as a genius." So, this time Su Yusong was silent for half a cup of tea. Then he said, "But according to what you just said, if Li Yunxin was in the city of Wei, she used the power of prayers from the 36 temples as a guide, and drew the vitality of hundreds of thousands of people into the painting array. Then this time, he used the resentment of hundreds of thousands of souls in the wild forest as a primer. What is he going to draw into the big formation he might have set in the wild forest? After all, it is such a big formation. Bean grandmother stared at the man in the light and said 5 words. Demons and cultivators. Everything he has done so far is to try to provoke the demons and Xianmen into fighting. Now that he went to Yunshan, according to what you said, he is going to hand over the demons' battle plan with both hands. He claimed and purposely made you think that he really wants both the demons and Xianmen to suffer, so that he can have a chance to breathe. But he is also using such an obvious goal to hide his real intention. He hopes that the demons and Xianmen cultivators will have countless casualties in the battle. The remnant souls of the demons and cultivators of the true state are extremely difficult to destroy, but the demons and cultivators below the true state are in the tens of thousands. Such tens of thousands of remnant souls, the spiritual power, demon power, resentment contained in them, how can it be compared to the souls of millions or tens of millions of mortals? Such a powerful force is enough for him to reconstruct the demon body of a Taoist master. Bean grandmother let out a sigh, as if her mind was stirred up by this terrible plan. Even her words had to be careful. What he wants is not to hide from the world, but nirvana. This is his way out. After saying this, the 4 of them were silent for a long time. He didn't know if they were really shocked by the grand plan that might exist. After a dozen breaths, Su Yusong said, if that is really the case, then go to the wild forest immediately. Let's go and see if he has really made the arrangements over there. If it is, his voice became serious, destroy it immediately. Destroy it. Or you can destroy it at any time, but don't let him know. Can you guarantee this? Bean grandmother hesitated a bit. I can try. But Su Yusong slowly said, I want you to guarantee it. That nothing will go wrong. But Bean grandmother's expression didn't change, only saying, I can try. So Su Yusong hesitated a bit then sighed, fine. But you need to know. If Li Yunxin really has a method to reconstruct the 6 desires tribulation body, this is the closest we'll get to it. You can't make any mistakes. Keep him in your hands. Bean grandmother didn't say anything else, only nodded solemnly. At this time, the purple amulet's spiritual power was also exhausted. The light trembled, quickly turned into specks of light, and disappeared into the night. Bean grandmother continued to stand still for a while, then sighed. He really is Li Chuanfeng's son. She sighed in a low voice, then turned to look at Lu Ling. Her mouth was slightly open, her face was full of shock, as if she couldn't speak. Bean grandmother thought for a bit, then said to her, you died in his hands, he schemed against you so much. It's a glorious death. Up until tonight, Li Yunxin had stayed in the Cloud Mountain for 6 days. 6 days on the Cloud Mountain was like a snap of fingers to the outside world. During these 6 days, he talked a lot with Exa and Shilio, but most of the time they talked about the art of painting, nothing else. Tonight, Exa and Shilio left, leaving Li Yunxin sitting alone in the treehouse. It was so dark in the forest that he couldn't even see his own fingers. But if he slowly got used to it, he would realize that there was still light. There was always night light coming through the gaps between the leaves. But for demons with extraordinary eyesight, it was enough. Li Yunxin sat for a while, then stood up. He walked slowly with his hands clasped behind his back, passing through the huge trees and lush shrubs. Insects and birds chirped, and he could hear the rustling of small animals in the grass. After walking for another 15 minutes, he gradually heard the faint sound of water. It was the meandering river in the Cloud Mountain. Then his eyes gradually brightened. It was the night light reflecting off the surface of the river into the forest. From here, if one looked up, they would be able to see the floating mountain peak. It was right above him. So he stopped, exhaled softly, and suddenly said something that seemed to be out of the blue. Are you sure it's here? Chapter 449. But the surroundings were still very quiet. The insects and birds were still chirping, and only the wind brushing past the treetops answered his question. But it seemed that someone did answer him. So he suddenly laughed. Oh, I should have just left you there, right? Left you there, you. At this point he stopped. It seemed that the person he was talking to had interrupted him. He listened quietly for a while and sighed helplessly. Oh, okay. Using other people's magical powers, right? I left you there that night. There was magma everywhere. Magma is molten rock. I don't even know how to do it, Sage. There was no one within a radius of 1 or 2 miles. And even if there was, it would be the soldiers from that night. You acted up again, using other people's magical powers. I'm lucky you didn't jump into the magma and kill yourself. He stopped after saying this. After a few more breaths, he sighed. You're the one who blamed me for bringing you here. Do you know how rare it is for me to be kind for once? You have to know. The person who couldn't see him said something. Li Yunqin suddenly spread out his hands and sat on the grass. It was a slope towards the river. He sat down with his back against the giant tree, facing the sparkling water. The scenery was indeed very good, but he didn't do it for the scenery. I'm not going, he said angrily. After a while he sneered, Ha! It's none of my business. After another 2 breaths, You're unreasonable. You're unreasonable. Then it was quiet. It was quiet for half an hour. Finally he stood up and said, But don't be long-winded. Then Li Yunqin raised his head. The floating mountain was right above him, and its inverted tip was facing his head, as if it would fall at any time. He was nearly 1,000 meters away from the small mountain. But the small mountain was actually huge, so it still blocked half of the sky in his field of vision. He squinted his eyes, and carefully looked at the tip at the bottom of the mountain. Finally, at a certain angle, at a certain time, he found a fleeting light. It was like the cold light of metal. He repeatedly confirmed the existence of that thing, lowered his head, and took a deep breath. Then lingering clouds and mist slowly rose from his hair and clothes. This was very similar to when he was about to reveal his fiend god incarnation. However, this time, he did not seem to get what he wanted. His body only grew a little. There were only some faintly discernible scales on his cheeks and arms. Some kind of power, some kind of restriction, forced his divine art back. But it seemed to be enough. He then took out a piece of magic paper and a magic brush from his sleeve. He moistened his mouth with the pen and quickly drew a line on the paper. Then he shook the paper and it fell to the ground. The black line on the paper immediately turned into a rope. This rope was like a snake with its head held high, and as soon as it appeared, it rose straight up into the sky. It stretched out continuously from the surface of the paper until it disappeared into the night sky and could no longer be seen clearly. But it did not stop. This went on for almost an hour before the rope stopped moving. It seemed to have climbed to the top and entangled somewhere at the bottom of the inverted mountain. Li Yunqin grabbed it and could feel it swaying gently in the night wind, as if it would fall off at any moment. But he still pulled and tested it a little. It was very firm. So he grabbed the rope with one hand and pulled hard. A deep pit appeared on the ground. The juice of the grass and leaves splashed, emitting a fragrant smell. His body borrowed the force of this pull and stomp, and with a whoosh he leaped up along the rope. In one breath, he leaped more than 10 meters high. When the upward momentum slightly weakened, he climbed the rope again. His whole body was like a white light attached to the rope, quickly rising up. It only took him a quarter of an hour to reach a height of nearly 1,000 meters, and he touched the bottom of the floating mountain. At this time, he could no longer see the edge of the small mountain. His whole field of vision was covered by the mountain rocks, but under his feet was 1,000 meters high. It was as if the earth had turned around, and even the gravity had changed. The rope he drew was tightly fastened to an iron hook at the bottom of the mountain. This iron hook was as big as a person. When Li Yunqin looked up from the foot of the mountain, he saw the reflection of this thing. In fact, this iron hook was very well hidden. It was wedged between 2 protruding rocks at the bottom. Only a section as long as an arm was exposed, and it was also covered by weeds. He exerted force with his wrist again, and jumped to the rock. Then, he shook the rope. It immediately turned into spots of light and disappeared. From the ground, the bottom of the floating mountain was sharp, and there was no place to stand. But now that he came up, he knew that the bottom was not as smooth as it looked. There were many rocks gathered together, so naturally, it was uneven. Even the bottom of the mountain, which looked sharp, was pieced together by 4 huge rocks, with the big iron hook hidden in the middle. Further up, the layers of rocks pressed against each other and stretched diagonally upward, like a huge and boundless cornice. He stood on this rock and let out a light breath. As far as the eye could see, it was dark below. Only the winding river was faintly visible in the night, as if it was alive. Then he waved his sleeve. Another figure came out of the sleeve like a gust of wind and stood beside him. If it was not Su Sheng, who else could it be? This Su Sheng looked down first, then took 3 steps back and pressed his back against the stone wall. He took 2 breaths and said to Li Yunxin, "This is the first time I look down from a place like this. If I fall down, it will be bad." Li Yunxin shrugged. "Say it. What should we do next?" In fact, this matter started from 6 days ago, or even earlier. Li Yunxin didn't throw Su Sheng away. Instead, he kept him. Su Sheng was very unwilling to do so. In his words, it was not time to return to Cloud Mountain yet. However, he did not have much room to resist. This proved one of Li Yunxin's conjectures. The previous Su Wang and the current Su Sheng were different in appearance and temperament. However, they both had one thing in common. They seemed to be unable to use supernatural powers. Su Sheng did not hide this fact and admitted it. Both Su Wang and Su Sheng were reincarnated reincarnations, which was similar to Meng's situation. The similarity was that they could not use supernatural powers for the time being. The difference was that Su Sheng could borrow other people's supernatural powers for his own use. For example, when Li Yunxin met him before, he could use the water vapor in his body through the surrounding plants. This was not his supernatural power, but the supernatural power of plants. The reason why Li Yunxin brought him to Yunshan was because she wanted a walking dictionary. He needed to understand the situation of Cloud Mountain and know where the things he might need were. However, he did not expect that by a stroke of luck, he was unable to ascend the floating mountain peak and was left on the ground. This space also prohibited supernatural powers, so no matter how strong his body was, he could not jump almost 1,000 meters into the sky. As for the birds under Su Yusong's feet, they did not seem to be natural creatures. Li Yunxin had never seen them in the forest, so their nest should be on the floating mountain. These birds should be some kind of transportation controlled by Su Yusong. As for Su Sheng, he told him that there was another method that could allow him to ascend the floating mountain. At the same time, he also told him that Little Cloud Mountain was not always like this. At least 1,000 years ago, this space that prohibited supernatural powers did not exist. Chapter 450. Everything started on a long summer afternoon. At that time, the small Cloud Mountain was no different from the outside world. The 4 seasons were the same, and the time was the same. At that time, the vast platform at the top of the Cloud Mountain wasn't empty and lonely. There were many palaces and houses on it, and countless plants flourished because of the power of talismans and spells. People in the mortal world said that there was a kingdom of heaven on top of the Cloud Mountain decorated with gold and silver, and white jade as a bridge, which was actually not a delusion. At that time there was indeed such a thing. Then a huge cloud of fire fell from the sky and hit the Cloud Mountain. At that time, there were 234 cultivators on the mountain peak, and 23 people above the realm of true. There were 14,665 mortal servants. The cloud of fire fell on the mountain peak and released a terrifying and powerful force. In an instant, all the people and buildings on the mountain were turned into ashes, and not a single trace was left. When Su Sheng told the story, he emphasized that the "in an instant" here wasn't a descriptive term, but indeed, a time even shorter than the blink of an eye. No one knew where this terrifying force came from, and what was inside the cloud of fire. After destroying the people and buildings on the mountain peak, the cloud of fire went down again, and created a path that led directly to the small Cloud Mountain. With its ferocious momentum, it should have destroyed the small Cloud Mountain inside as well. However, the small Cloud Mountain wasn't something ordinary. Within the floating mountain, there was a magic formation set up by the Devis. It was that magic formation that drove the entire Cloud Mountain high up in the sky to patrol the midland of the 10 Directions world. And it possessed an unimaginable power. Therefore, after the cloud of fire reached the floating mountain peak, it suddenly disappeared without a trace. No one knew where this cloud of fire came from and what it contained. But some cultivators thought that this was a sign that the Devis didn't send down any more decrees for the next 1,000 years. Perhaps the cultivators in the mortal world did something wrong to anger the Devis. And this was a sign that the punishment from the Devis was coming. But the real effect was that some kind of strange force began to appear inside the small cloud mountain. And from then on, the space that restricted magical powers slowly grew larger. At first, it was only one or a few spots, but it quickly spread out, connecting into lines and patches. Finally, the space inside the small cloud mountain was filled with this strange force. Magical powers were finally forbidden. At that time, there were still 3 saints on the cloud mountain. This kind of thing, don't talk about thousands of years. It was unheard of even since the prosperity of humanity. Therefore, at that time, our first thought wasn't fear, but curiosity, Su Sheng said to Li Yunxin as he leaned against the stone wall. Before this, Li Yunxin's divine ability was also sealed, so he couldn't release resurgence. Su Sheng only told him to go to a certain place, at a certain time at a certain night, and how to get to the floating mountain. He didn't say anything else. He was brought into Mount Shaoyan by Li Yunxin, and grumbled for a while. After complaining, he asked Li Yunxin to take him up to the sky, intending to retrieve his body. But at least when it came to the floating mountain, the two of them had the same goal. Hence, tonight's incident happened. Now that they were on the upside down of the floating mountain, Li Yunxin realized that some of his divine abilities could actually be used. However, he did not intend to blindly follow Su Sheng's guidance and continue to move forward. These old monsters that had lived for hundreds or even thousands of years were all very scheming. If he couldn't figure things out first, how could he be at ease leaving his life and time in this place to Su Sheng? Although he didn't care much about his life now, he had already come this far with great difficulty. He didn't want to fail at the last step. Therefore, he wanted Su Sheng to explain things clearly. Then he would decide what to do tonight. When he heard this and Su Sheng mention the 3 saints, he suddenly felt a strange emotion. Therefore, he stood at the edge of the mountain, thought for a moment and interrupted. Art Saint. What's her name? Her. Su Sheng smiled, but the meaning was unclear. You asked the right person. In this world, there are only 2 people who know her real name. Including you, there are 3. She said her surname is Chun, and her name is Chen. Chen Zhao. Li Yunxin saw Su Sheng write a few strokes in the air as he said this word, so he repeated it in a low voice. Since the calligrapher said it, it shouldn't be fake. But he was slightly disappointed. He thought that such an interesting girl's name would be interesting too. Who knew that it would only be 2 words? The surname Chen was common, but the word Chen was even more common. This was the first time he suddenly froze. The first time Li Yunxin heard of this word was because he heard a story. Of course, it wasn't in this life, but in his previous life, there was a person who raised dragons for the Yellow Emperor. Because he raised them well, the Yellow Emperor gave him a surname, Dragon Rearing. Dragon Rearing, Chenlong Dragon. Art Saint Chen Zhao appeared about 2,200 years ago, when the 213th generation sword saint, Pei Yunjin, failed his tribulation and traveled the world. She only cultivated for 200 years before entering the realm of emotionlessness and establishing her own sect. At that time, 2,000 years ago, it was an era of great changes. Shinryu appeared, the Golden Rock King appeared. Chen Zhao Dragon. Chen Zhao wondered if the two were related. This thought lingered in his mind for 2 breaths. Then he smiled and shook his head. You know her name? I'm the 3rd person who knows her name. What about the other one? Su Sheng smiled too, a bit proud. The other person? Actually, you've already met her. You've seen her many times. But I won't tell you. I want you to think about it slowly. It seemed to be revenge for Li Yunxin's argument with him earlier. This saint, who had lived for thousands of years, was about to become a real young man after reincarnating. Chen Zhao didn't know if this was a good or bad thing. Li Yunxin tried to think for a while. But then he gave up. This wasn't a good time to think about such things. If it was important to tonight's operation, Su Sheng wouldn't hide it. Since that was the case, he wouldn't think about it for now. He just remembered it. You're curious. Then, Su Xing chuckled. Then Chen Zhao made some small things. You should know that when this space first appeared, it was just a few dots. Later on, it became a piece, and the original space became dots. Thus, she used a painting Dao technique to wrap up those dots. It's the flying birds you saw. She was the one who had drawn those birds. There's a space in her body that wasn't restricted, so she hid spiritual qi. She could come and go freely here, and became the treasure of Cloud Mountain. Su Sheng pointed down. The fake saint left you down there, and didn't worry, because this thing can only be used on the mountain, and after knowing the technique. It's almost 1,000 meters high. I'm not afraid that you can come up. Li Yunqin sighed. Yes, at this height, and with a treasure that can see me at any time, I'm not worried. But, after he said this, Su Xing suddenly laughed and looked at him with disdain. Li Yunqin frowned. What? See you at any time? Su Xing grinned. His 2 rows of teeth flashed in the darkness. You're talking about the mirror talisman, right? He reached out and made a gesture in the air. A mirror appeared. It can let you see the people outside the mountain, and it can even attract the people outside the mountain, isn't it? Su Yusong had indeed used this method that day. Su Sheng had said that he could see the time outside very slowly, but he was actually letting him see Lu Gongzan. Moreover, it was also a reminder to him that although his supernatural power was forbidden in this place, Su Yusong could fly around in this space and see his movements at any time. It could be said to be killing 3 birds with 1 stone. But hearing Su Sheng's words and seeing his expression, it didn't seem to be the case. Li Yunqin had indeed asked him about this before the operation tonight. After all, he'd been here for 6 whole days, which meant that he'd been an actor for 6 whole days. His every move and every word was for Su Yusong, who might be watching him on the floating mountain. But tonight, Su Xing only told him that he was guaranteed to be fine. So there's something strange about this. Li Yunqin sighed. That thing is called the mirror talisman? I've been played by him for 6 days. Humph. The mirror talisman. It's called a talisman, but it's actually not a method of Daotong or Kenzo. Su Xing sneered. It's Chen Zhao's method. Previously, when there were only dots left, she drew those flying birds. Even before that, when there were still faces left, she drew the mirror talisman. There are very few of them, only about 100. That fake divine sage really thinks highly of you, because you used one of them. And that purple talisman, it can talk to people thousands, or even tens of thousands of miles away. It's also Chen Zhao's method. It's just that there are more, tens of thousands of them in the secular world. Alas, your painting Dao, although it's also considered a heavenly technique, is fundamentally different from the Dao of calligraphy and the Dao of swords. Speaking up to this point, he paused and deliberately looked at Li Yunqin from the corner of his eyes. How could Li Yunqin not know what he meant? After all, he used to be a saint. He had also spent many years with the art saint, who had the highest cultivation in painting Dao. Even if he didn't cultivate this Dao, he must have understood some principles. From the perspective of a saint, cultivation must be different from theirs. He had real skills in his heart. But before this, Li Yunqin didn't show him the respect that a saint should have. So he just wanted to see Li Yunqin's unwillingness to admit defeat. However, Li Yunqin straightened his face and bowed. He bowed deeply and said, True saint above, for the sake of our friendship of 1,000 years in Cloud Mountain with the founder of my painting sect, please answer Junior Li Yunqin's doubts. Su Sheng was stunned and didn't know what to say. Although he had experienced Li Yunqin's ability to change faces faster than flipping a book, he didn't expect him to be so shameless. After being stunned for a long time, he sighed helplessly. Ah, really. Alas, that Chen Zhao in your temperament is really. Forget it. I'll tell you about it. He sighed again and said, The fundamental method of Daotong and Kenzo is to borrow the spiritual power that exists between heaven and earth. We cultivators temper our bodies and souls, and refine the spiritual qi from the outside into our bodies. In fact, we only borrow a very small part of it. If we really want to use Dharma spells and supernatural powers, The spiritual power does not come from the snow mountain and ocean of qi. Instead, it uses the spiritual power in the snow mountain and ocean of qi to draw the spiritual power between heaven and earth. This is the way of Daotong and Kenzo. And you're painting Dao. He glanced at Li Yunxin. Li Yunxin was actually listening respectfully and with a gentle expression. His way of doing things was really hard to find in this world. He sighed again. Your painting Dao on the surface seems to be using the spiritual power in the snow mountain and ocean of qi to draw the spiritual qi between heaven and earth. But in fact, if you look deeper, it is engraved in the depths of the great Dao of this world. He paused and looked at Li Yunxin. Li Yunxin also looked at him. After 3 breaths, he realized that Su Sheng was waiting for Li Yunxin to give him feedback. However, Li Yunxin didn't understand anything and was waiting for him to continue. So Li Yunxin frowned. More common? Su Sheng also frowned. How common? Li Yunxin sighed. There was a reason why he gave the jade slip of enlightenment away. The art saint's way of thinking was very similar to Su Sheng's. Many things that he thought needed a lot of theoretical support and basic systems to understand, but the art saint treated them as common things. For example, he was explaining a world-class problem to a high school student, but the whole thing was easy to prove. What the hell? Such a treasure was actually of little value to him. Its use and the trouble it brought was even less than the benefit of giving it to Exai Shilio to prove her identity. Back then it was for this thing. They had lived in seclusion for so many years, and then they attracted such a disaster. So he spread out his hands. Then can I understand that the method of painting Dao is very unique? At a low level, it is indeed similar to many of the cultivation methods of Daotong and Kenzo, but the more profound it is, the more divergent and different it is. In the end, it can almost do many things that the first 2 can't do. For example, those birds and mirror talismans? There's also the rope that you used just now. Su Sheng looked at him meaningfully. A few days ago, you painted in front of Exai Shilio. This place should have prohibited supernatural powers, but your painting intent did not decrease. Just now, you used the technique of turning illusions into reality at the foot of the mountain. It's because in this space where Daotong and Kenzo's supernatural powers are prohibited, the Dao of painting can be used. Although it's also restricted, you can still find a gap and see some Dao. And this gap is also left by Chen Zhao. Previously, you said that she used to enlighten the birds and used the surface to create the mirror talisman. Where we came from just now is the emptiness formed by the point and the surface. This emptiness, Su Sheng sighed, and his expression became gloomy. This emptiness is from the past. Before the war. Wrong things. Wrong things. His expression was gloomy, and his tone was also gloomy. Then he kept sighing, and gradually, it was difficult for him to complete his sentence. In just the blink of an eye, as if his bones had been pulled out, he collapsed on the ground. Forget it. There's nothing more to say. In this world. Thus, Li Yunxin knew that the third personality that he had pulled out from Su Sheng's subconscious had been drowned again. The emptiness and the past that Su Sheng mentioned seemed to be referring to the time when the art saint was possessed, and the 2 sages and the art saint had a falling out. After talking about the past, the feelings of regret triggered an ocean-like melancholy in his heart, causing him to sink into a terrible depression again. But now, his mind was focused on another word, emptiness. His current identity was also emptiness. After receiving the kiss of Qi, he had never heard an explanation of this word from Daotong, Kenzo, or any other demons, but now he heard it from the former art saint. These 2 emptiness, were they the same concept or rather similar? What did the essence of the Dao of painting have to do with this? Li Yunxin suddenly felt that he seemed to understand a little what Su Sheng meant by engraving in the Dao. However, it was still only a vague concept, and it was not clear and definite. If he wanted to know more, he had to understand the Dao of painting better. And this was also one of the reasons why he wanted to go up the floating mountain. Su Sheng told him that there were many relics of the art saint left in the halls of the floating mountain. Compared to the things in the Jade Scroll of Enlightenment, those relics were more scattered and fragmented. Some were left behind when she was experimenting with new tricks, and some were left behind for the two sages to play with when she was bored. But most of them were used to pass on to the painting Taoist priests under her. Li Yunxin knew that there were few painting talents in the past. There were very few cultivators above the true state. This might be related to the art saint's habit of easily proven and easily obtainable. But on the other hand, it meant, with his current cultivation, the things that the art saint left in the halls of the floating mountain were things that he could learn and understand. Before this, on the path of painting, he was like a genius child born in a scholarly family, with a solid foundation and good grades from a young age. But in one night, his family was destroyed, and he could step into a higher-level academy, but he couldn't. He could only take lessons from the Jade Scroll of Enlightenment. Although his talent was good, in the end it was not systematic. But now, he finally knew that there was an easy-to-understand teaching material. He wanted this thing because he felt that there might be some great secret hidden in the Tao of painting. And on the other hand, the feeling of not being proficient in the field that he should be proficient in, whether it was in his previous life or this life, was absolutely intolerable to him. He was used to being an outstanding person and a genius. But now on the path of painting, he had become a laggard. Even if it was just to let his own thoughts be clear, he had to. He couldn't just barge into the floating mountain's temples. So he took a deep breath and sighed. He walked in front of Su Sheng and picked him up. He had to take the risk and split a fourth personality from his sea of consciousness. It was dangerous ahead. Without Su Sheng, he might not be able to move an inch. Chapter 451. This time, it did not go as smoothly as the previous two times. Su Sheng's consciousness was already aware of this matter. It would be very difficult for him to be like the previous two times, where he would be able to do it while talking and laughing. Thus, it took almost 2 hours before Su Sheng was able to pull himself together. However, he did not dare to mention anything related to the art saint. Su Sheng's previous emotional breakdown was due to similar topics. It seemed that the battle 1,000 years ago had left a deep impression on him. Or perhaps he was still brooding over the fact that he had lost that body. This was probably why he encouraged Li Yunxin to explore the floating mountain at night. Therefore, after another hour, the two of them finally moved. During this time, they did not do anything else. Su Sheng asked Li Yunxin to draw many talismans. Even if it was a painting technique, it could only unleash a portion of its power here. Li Yunxin could cast spells in the air a long time ago, but now he had to rely on talismans. Fortunately, although he did not use it often, he had a lot of it. Su Sheng did not practice painting in the past, but he had been with the art saint for a long time, so he had some understanding of it. Therefore he instructed Li Yunxin, "I need 3 of these. I need 5 of these. The more of these the better. I don't need these." Finally, when everything was ready, Su Sheng heaved a sigh of relief. He took 2 steps forward and turned around. He was leaning against the stone wall as if he was afraid of heights. Now he walked to Li Yunxin's side and pointed at the stone wall. "Open it from here, and you can go in." Li Yunxin did not ask any questions. He walked forward and tried to push it, but the stone wall did not move. Therefore he exerted some strength. Fine scales immediately appeared on the back of his hand. With a muffled grunt he struck hard. The surface of the stone wall immediately stirred up a cloud of dust. Soil and stone fell to the ground, revealing a slightly brighter surface. The bottom of the stone wall was made of steel. It was just that the surface was covered with soil and stone over the years. But the steel was also good steel. It did not rust at all. Li Yunxin frowned. If he still had his supernatural power, and could summon the incarnation of a demon, this thing was just a piece of paper. He could break it with a little force. But now he had less than 10% of his cultivation. It was indeed difficult to break it. Su Sheng patted his shoulder from behind. "Let me." Li Yunxin laughed. "Don't make trouble. Let me try the talisman." Su Sheng's reincarnation was not much stronger than ordinary martial artists in the mortal world. Even Li Yunxin couldn't break it, let alone him. But Su Sheng walked forward, reached out his hand to touch the edge of the steel wall, and then brushed it lightly. Another wave of dust and stones fell down, and a handle appeared. Su Sheng grabbed the handle and pulled. There was a creaking sound from inside the steel door, and it was pulled open without any resistance. He turned his head and smiled at Li Yunxin. Then he sighed with some emotion. This door sigh. When I first made it, there was no stone platform. But after the battle on the floating mountain, the mountain was almost shattered. That's why it looks like this. He walked in and touched the wall. At that time, it was not long after the fire cloud landed on Cloud Mountain. It was said that the little Cloud Mountain was not a big deal, but in the end there was still a crack here that led straight to the ground. Chen Zhao had drawn a door at the end. At that time, whenever she saw the servants slacking off, she would order them to go down and open the door. Something like, "Open the door." Once it was opened, they would fall. Sighing, he turned to look at Li Yunxin. "Why are you standing there?" Li Yunxin looked at him. "Why didn't you say so earlier?" Su Sheng blinked. "Aren't we talking now? I said the door needs to be pulled." He frowned and shrugged. "Don't play at a time like this. If you die, you can rebuild your body. If I die, all my efforts will be in vain." Hearing this, Su Sheng tilted his head and stared at him for a while. Suddenly he laughed. "Ha! I didn't expect you to be like this. Is it because you are getting closer to Chen Zhao's treasure that you become more and more restless? Is that why you are like this?" There were many people in the world that should not be joked with, but Li Yunxin was not one of them. But now, he was acting like a calculative and narrow-minded guy. Hearing Su Sheng's words, Li Yunxin frowned again. But in the end he snorted and walked in. The door closed behind him, and the surroundings became dark. Li Yunxin took out a talisman and shook it. It lit up. It did look like a natural tunnel. It was twisted and turned wide and narrow, and was not artificially carved. The wide part was like a small house, but the narrow part only allowed one person to pass through sideways. The light from the talisman was soft, but it shone very far. Li Yunxin saw that the tunnel extended diagonally upwards. When it reached the northwest, it suddenly became steeper, as if it was going straight up and down. "So no one has walked through here," Su Sheng said in a low voice. His voice echoed in the passageway, buzzing. "After I was plotted against by the Freemasons, one of my clones left the floating mountain from here. It seems that they don't know this path yet. Now let's give it a try." So he walked forward. After only a quarter of an hour, Li Yunxin knew what "no one has walked through here" meant. This passage wasn't something that ordinary people could use. For example, the tunnel suddenly curved upwards in the northwest. He looked up and found that this straight tunnel was at least 20 meters high. A person could fall down if they put their hands and feet together, but it was impossible to climb up from below. Su Sheng gestured with his hands and feet, inviting him to go in. Li Yunxin walked over silently. He stretched out his hands, grabbed the stone wall, and exerted force. His fingers immediately pierced into it. He then struggled outwards, creating a hole in the ground. At this moment, his demonic body was about to appear, but he was much taller than ordinary people. He squeezed his way up the stone path, almost expanding the tunnel, leaving behind many stone pits for his hands and feet to climb. When he reached the top, it suddenly opened up. It was another wide stone cave. He looked down again. Su Sheng had folded the illuminating talisman and inserted it into his hair bun. He was slowly climbing up the pit he left behind. He did not have the demeanor of an expert at all. He walked and looked around in this stone cave, waiting for Su Sheng to climb up. It was dark and dry here all year round. There was no moss, only pure stone and soil. The talisman he had written was like a piece of paper that could light up. It was drawn into a circle like a lamp. It was folded into a thin long torch. He held it in his hand and looked at the stone wall casually. Actually, it was just a habit. But he did not expect to see something. It looked like a mural. It was more like a chalk drawing. There were many small people drawn with white lines. The head was formed by a circle, the eyes were 2 white dots, and the mouth. The arc meant that they were smiling, the circle meant that they were shouting, and the straight line meant that they were indifferent. The body was a line, and so were the fingers of the 4 limbs. These people were smeared on the stone wall. It was like a child who had just become interested in graffiti and randomly drew it. This style, it was the art saints. Li Yunxin's heart skipped a beat. He took out another talisman and threw it out. Then, a soft light filled the entire stone room, and he saw the whole picture. There were about 10 such people on the wall, and they all had different expressions. Some had 2 small circles for their eyes, and their mouths were also small circles, as if they were shocked. Some had round eyes, but their mouths were curved like crescent moons. It was obvious that they were angry. Some had semi-round eyes and round mouths, as if they were roaring angrily. They seemed to be holding all kinds of things in their hands. There were swords, spears, axes, and broadswords. They looked like they were fighting someone, but there were no such things on the wall. At this moment, Su Sheng finally climbed up. Panting slightly, he sat beside the cave and took a few breaths. Then he turned to look at Li Yunxin. "Ha, you see these things? These I beat them all in." Li Yunxin frowned. "Chen Zhao's work?" Su Sheng smiled and stood up. He slowly walked to the stone wall and touched the painting. This is when she was possessed. She started from the floating mountain. She's indeed skilled. With a wave of his hand, he could summon hundreds or even thousands of such small figures, and they swarmed over. Zhuamuja and I piled them in as soon as we met. It took us 3 breaths to clear them all. Then, I was harmed by the Freemasonry. I used this path to escape and saw these along the way. I think they must have been suppressed by my suppressed talisman at that time. If you walk forward, you can see more. The further you go, the more there are. Actually, Li Yunxin really wanted to ask about the details of the art saints possessed. However, with the previous example, he could only listen. It was not convenient for him to ask. If something were to happen to Su Sheng again, he might have to spend another 2 to 4 hours of effort. Thus, he sighed inwardly and placed his hand on the lines. Then he retracted his hand as if he had been electrocuted, his eyes widening. There was still some spiritual qi in the lines. These little people were drawn and formed. They were the finished products, just like firewood being ignited or clay being burned into ceramics. Then, they were suppressed by the master of calligraphy's suppressed talisman. It was like a flame being extinguished or a ceramic being smashed. Although they still looked like lines, they were actually like firewood that could not be restored to its original state or broken ceramics that could not be restored. They were already useless, but now that he touched these lines, they still had spiritual qi. This meant that they could be summoned again. Was this the work of a saint? This was already beyond the means of painting that he knew. Seeing his expression, Su Sheng laughed. "Did you notice it too? They still have spiritual qi and can be summoned again. These little people are exceptionally hard to deal with and extremely annoying. In the past, when I used the suppressed talisman, even a true state great demon would be beaten back to its original state. But these little things don't hurt when they hit or bite, but they are extremely difficult to destroy. The ones that you see now, I have suppressed 416 of them before they obediently imprinted on the stone wall. Now you try to summon them again. Hey, you are indeed interested. Do you want to try?" Of course, Li Yunxin wanted to try. He was extremely interested in all the traces left by the art saint. Someone had once used the art saint's shadow to break his Taishang state of mind. Now he had to understand more. It would be good if things changed again in the future. At least he would have a way to deal with it. Thus, he put his hand on it again and felt the flow of spiritual qi in the picture. However, the flow of spiritual qi in this picture was extremely simple. It was a world of difference from the astonishing complexity of the Octave Treasure's ancient scroll. Simple, smooth, and harmonious. It was filled with the beauty of harmony. Even though it had been suppressed more than a dozen times and was broken, it was still unobstructed. Li Yunxin's expression changed. He knew that this kind of realm, even if he was in his best condition, he would not be able to reach it. This made a certain thought in his heart burn brighter. He had to obtain the things that Art Saint Chen Zhao had left in the floating mountains palaces. He had to make himself understand and master those things. It wasn't just to do something with them. It was because he really couldn't bear the feeling of helplessness every time he touched the ruins left by the art saint. Whether it was his previous life or this one, he hated this feeling. Since he had done something, he had to do it to the extreme. Otherwise, How would he be any different from those ordinary mortals? With this thought in mind, he suddenly retracted his finger on the stone wall. Under the suppression of this space that forbade supernatural powers, the spiritual chi in his body flowed into the picture like a trickle, trying to summon the little people again. It was a success. Green light suddenly flashed on the stone wall. In just a breath's time, these 10 people, who had been drawn with simple lines, jumped down from the stone wall at the same time. As soon as they jumped down, they became noisy. It was as if the moment their expressions froze, their thoughts and emotions were frozen as well. Now that they were resurrected, they continued to shout what they hadn't shouted, and continued to vent their anger. "Song, you bastard! If you have the guts, come and fight me one-on-one. Let's see if I won't beat you until all your teeth fall out. What kind of hero is hiding? Aha, you're a coward. Pooey pooey pooey, a dog's mouth can't spit out ivory." All kinds of curses immediately filled the entire stone room. Li Yunxin was stunned. Su Sheng was even more dumbfounded. The 10 little people were holding knives, spears, and clubs, bearing their fangs and claws. Their voices were also of different thickness. It sounded like there were men, women, old and young. When they were on the stone wall, they were simple people made of lines. Now that they jumped down, they were still lines. However, they had become lines that could stretch and contract freely, magically forming human shapes out of thin air. Looking at them, it was as if those things were picked up from a piece of paper. After being stunned for a moment, Su Sheng hurriedly waved his hand. "Disperse! Disperse!" When he shouted, his face was slightly red, as if he didn't expect that these things that had been imprinted on the stone wall for more than 1,000 years could still speak. Perhaps his shout was effective, or perhaps the space forbade spiritual power, causing the spirits of these little things that had just been resurrected to become unstable. They said what they hadn't finished in one breath. Then they suddenly froze, as if they had lost their commander. They seemed to be in a daze. After waking up from a deep sleep, everything around them had turned upside down, and they didn't know where they were at all. In just this short moment of daze, they suddenly fell apart. The circles and lines fell from midair like softened noodles, quickly disappearing. One breath's worth of time was all gone. Li Yunxin frowned and looked at Su Sheng. "Who said that?" The redness on Su Sheng's face had yet to fade. He snorted angrily. "Why do you think I said that these things are extremely annoying? That Chen Zhao's mouth is very vicious. These little things aren't made by him to beat people, but to scold people. Think about it. Suddenly, thousands of these little things come to scold you. Hey!" At this point, he stomped his foot angrily. "They're still scolding me now." Chapter 452. This was indeed the art saint's style, right? Earlier, Li Yunxin was still feeling sorry for the 10 little people. At this time, after hearing Su Sheng's words, a smile suddenly appeared in his heart. Chen Zhao was really interesting. As the art saint, he was already at the top of the human world in terms of painting. Yet he always left behind such playful things. However, under these simple and childish appearances, there was a hidden power and ingenuity that shocked the world. He was a little envious of Su Sheng. He had been with the art saint for 1,000 years, so he must have seen her many times. He wondered how she felt when she randomly drew those graffiti-like little people. But after Su Sheng yelled, he suddenly felt that he had lost the demeanor of an expert. He immediately stopped talking and continued to walk forward. As he walked, he muttered angrily, "Humph! It's only because it's a tribulation body. If it was my previous life, even if it was the previous tribulation bodies, I wouldn't be angry at something like this." Li Yunxin didn't know what the previous life and the previous tribulation bodies were like, but he just felt that Su Sheng's personality was more likable. But if the cultivators of the Xianmen were all like him, or if they were all like mortals, he didn't know whether it would be a blessing or a curse for the world. With this thought in mind, he followed. After leaving the spacious stone room, there was another winding passage, but this place was slightly flatter, and it was indeed suitable for people to walk. On the stone wall, he saw many little people suppressed in the stone. Li Yunxin put his hand on it again, and felt the flow of spiritual power. Just like in the stone room, they could all be summoned. Since it was possible, he decided to continue trying. Su Sheng said that these little people don't hurt when they hit, but they are fierce when they scold. But the problem was that don't hurt when they hit was something that the calligraphy saint had said when he was at his peak. Now that the floating mountain had been forbidden from using supernatural powers, if these things could help, it would be a great help. But just as he thought of this, a thought flashed in his mind and he stopped. Then she turned to Su Sheng. You said that when the fire cloud landed on the cloud mountain, the art saint was still there. Su Sheng was slightly taken aback by his abrupt question. What's wrong? Li Yunqin frowned. But then he said that you fought with the art saint on the floating mountain. You even used the subduing talisman. At that time, shouldn't your divine abilities have been banned? Su Sheng was silent for a moment before he curled his lips. You don't have a master after all. Didn't he know that it was a taboo to ask someone else about their secret abilities? Naturally, I won't tell you. Li Yunqin sighed. I'm not trying to steal your skills. I just want to ask you, if you have a way to use your divine ability on the floating mountain, the two wandering souls that have taken over your body, is it possible that they can do the same? Su Sheng snorted. Them? Naturally, it was impossible. Wandering souls. Wandering souls. You said that the first time you saw a wandering soul was in the city of Wei, in a place called Qingliangzi, right? This question was not meant for Li Yunqin to answer. He continued, that Qingliangzi can be changed in a mortal's body at will. This was because the connection between the soul and the body of a mortal was not tight. Even a child might lose his or her soul when frightened, let alone a wandering soul with magical powers. In an instant, the mortal's soul would be squeezed out of his or her body. In this case, the mortal is also dead. Li Yunqin nodded. Then, as he spoke, he reached out and slowly stroked the little figure drawn on the stone wall, trying to summon it more carefully. The spiritual power contained in these lines varied. Some were strong, some were weak. Just now, the little figure in the stone room fell apart not long after it appeared. Perhaps it was because of the lack of spiritual power. Therefore, Li Yunqin slowly searched as he stroked. He planned to find at least one with a stronger spiritual power than the 10 before summoning them. Otherwise, if all of them were awakened at once, Su Sheng couldn't stand the vicious curses. He was also afraid of that kind of momentum, hundreds and thousands of things that looked like people gathered together and cursed. It was like a devil's voice pouring into his brain, making him crazy. When the sage of calligraphy and the sage of sword fought against the sage of art, they must have suffered a lot. Thinking about it today, he still turned pale. As he searched, he listened to Su Sheng continue. But it's not so easy to possess a cultivator. Naturally, you have to expel the spirit of the cultivator first, then they can possess the body. When a cultivator refines his spirit and body, the more he cultivates, the more stable he becomes. When the wandering soul runs into the body to fight with me, it is the situation where the host is strong and the guest is weak. There is absolutely no advantage to be taken. The higher the state of the cultivator, the more it is so. As for the state of Taishang Wang Qing Su Sheng snorted coldly. It sounded a little proud and a little regretful. At this time, the body has almost reached the state where the spirit is the spirit, and the spirit is the body. It is difficult to distinguish the spirit from the body. At this time, hearing his tone, Li Yunqin actually wanted to ask, since you were so strong, why were you still possessed? But now was not a good time to ask. As the saying goes, don't hit people in the face, don't expose people's shortcomings. If he asked at this time, Su Sheng would probably lie on the ground. He would have to spend a few hours to teach him a lesson. Really, it was like worshipping an ancestor. Although from a certain point of view, this was indeed the case. At this point, Su Sheng didn't seem to want to mention the details of the past, so he skipped over it and only said, in short, the body that was taken by the wandering soul is not so easy to wear. Moreover, it was even more impossible to use divine abilities in this kind of environment. The reason why I came to the floating mountain this time is to take back my body. The two of them talked as they walked. At this time, Li Yunqin finally sensed a particularly strong spiritual energy among the many lines. So he stopped, held his breath, and slowly poured spiritual energy into it. He didn't stop and asked, "If I take it back, will I become a saint again?" Su Sheng snorted coldly. "It has already been violated by them. I can't keep it even if I take it back. If I take it back, I will destroy it." At this point he suddenly heard a shrill shout. "Bah! If you want to know, why don't you beg me?" Following this shout, a small person jumped out from the stone wall. It waved the two broadswords in its hands like a spinning wheel. In the blink of an eye, the two sides of the stone wall were shaved off. Su Sheng had previously said that these little things don't hurt when they hit people. How is this don't hurt? Hearing this shout, Su Sheng sighed and frowned, looking like he was in extreme pain. Li Yunqin, on the other hand, stared at it. Every minute and every second felt like an eternity. It was like the first time he learned to paint, when he painted a phantom on his own. This was the relic of the art saint. If he could really keep it, the significance would be far greater than those octave treasure ancient scrolls. He could learn many brilliant arrangements and methods. So, after 2 breaths, the little man fiercely glared at him with his eyes, cursing with the corner of his mouth, and then stopped. Its 2 eyes turned into 2 dots. Then it turned into 2 lines, and then into 2 dots. It repeated several times in such a fast speed, as if it was blinking. Then it stood straight on the ground, no more changes. It should have failed again. Li Yunqin sighed, walked forward with one hand behind his back, trying to figure out what went wrong with the spiritual energy flow in this thing. This time, it was much better than before. At least, it didn't scatter on the ground. But when his right hand was just about to touch the circle that represented the little person's head, its thin arm swung up like lightning. A bright flame immediately burst out on Li Yunqin's arm. The big knife in the little person's hand hit and rubbed against his skin that had become as hard as iron. On his forearm, a finger-long wound was cut. Li Yunqin sucked in a breath of cold air and quickly retreated. But the little person didn't chase after him. Instead, it became alive again. Its eyes turned into an inverted semicircle again, and its mouth was also a semicircle. But there were many sawtooth-like lines in the middle, which looked like fangs. It smiled evilly, put one hand on its waist and raised the big knife with the other. "Hey! This road is opened by me, and this tree is planted by me. If you want to pass this road, pay the toll." At this moment, Li Yunqin felt that he might have experienced the despair of the master of calligraphy when he fought with the master of painting. Facing an opponent who didn't play according to the rules was indeed a very, very headache. After the little person shouted, he stared at Li Yunqin and Su Sheng with his eyes wide open. Li Yunqin looked down at the wound on his arm. Thanks to the strong body of the god and devil, the golden blood had stopped flowing, and the wound had also closed. However, his body of dragons in the true realm was refined in the sky full of fire clouds that golden light had blasted out with a Taoist instrument for nearly half an hour, and it was still fine. Now this little thing had cut a hole in it with a single slash. He took a deep breath. He realized that he had picked up a treasure, so he tried to take another step forward. The little person held the knife horizontally, standing between the two of them. "Hey! General coming from the front, report your name." Li Yunqin turned to look at Su Sheng. "What should we do next?" Su Sheng stared at the little person angrily and snorted. "This is your painting sex business. But you always come to ask me, what should we do?" He flicked his sleeves and turned his back, seeming to hate the little thing very much, and didn't even want to look at it. "Before coming in, I asked you to write so many talismans. Did I ask you to write them for fun?" After hearing his words, Li Yunqin seemed to wake up from a dream. Before coming here, Su Sheng did ask him to draw many talismans. Many of them were of little value in Li Yunqin's eyes, and he had never used them after learning them by himself. For example, the sealing evil suppressing talisman. Ordinary ghosts and spirits wouldn't dare to take the initiative to find trouble with cultivators, especially for 2 top-notch masters like them. And in this floating mountain, where would there be spirits that could be collected with such low-level talismans? Usually, He wasn't good at using painting methods to solve small problems, and preferred to rely on his strong body and demonic power to do things. Now that Su Xing mentioned it, he thought of this. He also realized, it turned out that Su Xing had already prepared those talismans. He had asked him to prepare those talismans to collect these little people who don't hurt. So he didn't say anything more. He took out a talisman from his sleeve, raised his hand, and threw it out. A green light emitted from the talisman, covering the little person's head. When the little person saw the light, it seemed to know where it came from. Immediately, it lost all its vigor, covering its head, and wanted to run away. As it ran, it shouted and cursed, "Hey, how dare you! Once my fierce navy goes out, everywhere we go, it won't end well." It stopped abruptly halfway through its sentence. Its figure suddenly disappeared, and the green light abruptly retracted. On top of the talisman, there was a little thing drawn with very simple and childish lines. It was still its appearance and posture before it was collected. Li Yunxin put his hand over it, and sensed the spiritual energy on the talisman. He felt that it was flowing smoothly and full, as if it had just been drawn. However, it wasn't drawn by him, but by the art saint, the immortal lord along the river during the Qingming festival painting, and misty sending slaves to Dakai Di Mao, could kill a true state sword cultivator with one punch. And the little person in this talisman could cut open the true state Long Sun's scales with one knife. Now that it was collected into the talisman, even if this talisman wasn't at the level of the octave ancient scroll, it wasn't far from it. It was worthy to be called a spiritual map. But the most terrible thing was this passage was so long. How many of such spiritual maps were there? Even a scheming person like Li Yunxin now had a smile on his face. Ever since he was forced to leave the mountain village, which item didn't he use all his strength and put his life on the line to obtain? But today, he had obtained so many treasures on this trip to the floating mountain. It was an unprecedented fortune for him in the past 10 years. With this joy, his body was full of energy. Originally, he only hoped to get out of this passage and search for the treasures left behind by the art saint. Now that he knew the treasures were beside him, he felt that this passage was too short. He carefully explored along the stone wall, leaving Su Sheng's face turning uglier and uglier. One had to know that every time he summoned one, the little one would definitely curse a few times. The two of them walked and stopped for 2 hours. When Li Yunxin finally reached the end of the passage, he didn't know how many talismans he had in his hands. Su Sheng had also been scolded a few hundred times, and his face was as green as an iron plate. And this end was somewhat out of Li Yunxin's expectation. In the end, they turned a corner. After turning this corner, a spacious hall suddenly appeared in front of them. Their eyes suddenly opened up, and they didn't feel cramped anymore. The hall was brightly lit, and everything could be seen at a glance. The light in the hall also shone directly into their stone passage. Li Yunxin's face turned cold, and he planned to retreat to the corner. He glanced forward, and knew that the hall in front of him was filled with all kinds of things, and it didn't look like it had been uninhabited for a long time. And if they appeared like this, they would most likely be discovered. But Su Xing took a step forward and stood firmly. His face was originally very ugly, but at this moment his confidence and aloofness returned, as if a king had returned to his own country, and he believed that he could control everything. He smiled and said in a low voice, "What are you afraid of? We are still in the mirror." Chapter 453. However, as he was speaking, someone had already walked into the hall. In fact, they could not be considered as humans. They were just monsters with human bodies. Li Yunxin had never seen those monsters before. They looked like vengeful spirits that had achieved Tao. There were fat and thin bodies, tall and short, and their heads were a mass of blurry fog. There was a light green fog, a light pink fog, and a slightly white fog. The fog rolled into a ball on their shoulders, revealing faintly discernible eyes and mouths. They looked like they were running and crying. They looked extremely scary. But although they looked scary, what they did was not scary. Look at them. They were also wearing colorful clothes. And they pushed the door open and entered the hall. Or they floated in or moved in crookedly. After entering, They went to different places in the hall. Su Sheng said, "We are still in the mirror." Hearing this, Li Yunqi noticed that they did not seem to be in this hall. This hall looked like a cool hall. There were no doors or windows on 3 sides, only thick pillars. Gauze curtains were hung between the pillars. When the wind blew, the gauze curtains danced lightly. It was very cool in summer. Outside the hall, there seemed to be bright sunshine, and it was a green scene. He did not know when it was dawn. This cool hall was covered with a mat, a couch, and a short table. On the table beside the mat, there were all kinds of fruits, and there seemed to be good wine. Not only these things, there were also dressing tables, cabinets, embroidered stools, embroidered beds, and so on. It seemed it was a place for young ladies to enjoy the cool breeze. Now he looked forward and saw a wooden table in front of him. On the table, there were all kinds of colorful bottles and jars, which should be used by women for dressing up. Then he realized it was not a wooden table. It should be a table. Right now the 2 of them were indeed behind a mirror, behind a dressing table. The various demons that had swarmed into the hall had already gathered together in 2s and 3s. Some were lying on the couch, enjoying the cool breeze. This posture was very enjoyable. However, their faces were twisted and ferocious, which made people feel cold. Some were holding a small fan and swooping on butterflies. However, their bodies were bloated, and their faces were twisted. Whenever it ran, it would emit a whimpering sound that would make one's scalp go numb. Li Yunqi subconsciously frowned at the sight of this group of demons dancing wildly. He almost flipped his palm, and was about to throw out a few talismans to seal the navy. However, an even more terrifying face suddenly appeared in front of the 2 of them, almost touching their faces. His face was gray and pink. The thick melancholy mixed together, like a person's skin melting and solidifying. One of the crooked eyes was as tall as Li Yunqi. Li Yunqi realized that he was much smaller than the monsters in the temple, since he was in the mirror. But as soon as she thought of this, she picked up the bottles and jars on the table, and began to dress herself. Li Yunqi couldn't bear to watch the horrifying scene any longer. He turned to Su Sheng and asked, "Why are there so many demons on the floating mountain?" His expression was solemn, and his tone was solemn. However, when Su Sheng heard his words, he suddenly burst into laughter. While laughing, he clapped his hands and shouted, "Yes, that's right. Yes, you also look like a demon, don't you?" "Ah." That Chinning said that I don't know the true meaning of painting. After saying this, he pulled Li Yunqi's hand and leaped forward. The 2 of them rushed out of the mirror, and directly passed through the face of the demon, who was dressing herself. Once they were out of the mirror, their bodies expanded. When they landed on the ground, they were about the same size as the demons. Li Yunqi's heart skipped a beat. He was afraid that he would alert the enemy. Did Su Sheng still think that he was a saint on the floating mountain? As soon as he thought of this, trouble indeed came. As soon as the 2 of them appeared in the temple, the demons who were playing with each other immediately quieted down. Then, they all turned their heads and stared at the 2 of them. Su Sheng immediately shouted, "What are you waiting for? The toys I told you to collect are for this very moment." Along with his words, the demons suddenly burst out, wailing like ghosts and howling like wolves. They all pounced towards them at the same time. If they were ordinary demons, Li Yunqi wouldn't be afraid at all. But on the way here, the scale armor was broken by the seemingly unremarkable little person. He knew that the floating mountain used to be the residence of a saint. Everything inside was not to be underestimated. Now that he heard Su Sheng shout, his heart skipped a beat. He immediately took out dozens of talismans from his sleeves and scattered them all over the sky. Before the demons could even touch the hem of the 2 of them, they immediately heard dozens of shouts of different thicknesses. "Hey, demons! Let go of my generous master." Dozens of little people descended from the sky. They waved the knives and spears in their hands, and attacked the demons head-on. Immediately, they started fighting with the demons. Taking this opportunity, Su Sheng pulled Li Yunqi again. "Let's go." It seemed that they wanted to rush out of the cool temple. Li Yunqi didn't ask whether they would alert the enemy. Because he was a smart person, he slowly realized that something was wrong. Everything was filled with a strange, familiar, and interesting sense of absurdity. He followed Su Sheng and ran forward. From where they were standing to the outside of the temple, it was only a dozen steps. But it was as if he was dreaming that he was running. The more he ran, the harder it was for him to move. The further he walked, the further he was from the outside of the temple. Moreover, there were always demons coming from both sides. Li Yunxin could only scatter more talismans to deal with them. After half an hour, the two of them finally covered the distance of a dozen steps. They finally rushed out of the temple. Then they were in a trance. With a series of crackling sounds, Li Yunxin and Su Sheng rolled from the wall to the ground. Along the way they knocked over some things. The cups were all toppled over and shattered into pieces. There were also sounds of cloth being torn and tables and chairs collapsing. It was even noisier than in the cool temple. The two of them finally stopped. Li Yunxin was leaning against a table that was about to collapse. He quickly reached out to support it. Su Sheng was pinned down by a chair. But he didn't scream or exert any force. He just slowly got up and gently lifted the chair. At the same time, he vigilantly observed the surrounding environment and listened to the surrounding sounds. Li Yunxin knew that they must have arrived at the real floating mountains group of palaces. Only then did he observe the surrounding environment. It was still night time. Now they were also in the house. Although it was called a house, it was also a small temple. The layout was orderly and clear. It seemed to be a study with the function of receiving guests. Soft light shone down from the roof. Li Yunxin recognized that it was the light of talismans. The tables and chairs in the house were mostly made of bamboo. The color was also simple and elegant. The doors and windows were wide open. There were also gauze curtains on the windows. It was somewhat similar to the cool temple. The two of them had just fallen on a tea table in the north of the house. It was now a mess. But from here, when they looked up, they could see a whole white wall. There was a large green glaze jar next to the wall. There were 3 thin bamboo poles in the jar. They cast sparse shadows on the white wall. It looked very interesting. There was another painting on the wall. He and Su Sheng had come out from that painting. The mirror before was in the painting. It was the first exit. The monster in the painting was the guard outside the first exit. And this painting itself was the second exit. The painter had almost created a limited small world in the painting. One of the Octave Treasure's ancient scrolls, Misty Nun de Kai Di Mao, also had a small world in it. Then could it be that this painting? Li Yunxin turned to look at Su Sheng. At this moment, Su Sheng was straightening the chair. He looked left and right by the window to make sure that no one had seen them. Then he turned to see the expression on Li Yunxin's face. He looked up at the painting again. A strange smile appeared on his face. "Ha! You're right. This is one of the Octave Treasure's ancient scrolls. Pleasure in the Cool Palace. The exit we came from is in the mirror in this painting." After saying this, he walked to the white wall with his hands behind his back. He stared at the pleasure in the Cool Palace for a while. He couldn't help but laugh. "Ha, Li Yunxin, take a look. What do you think of this painting?" There was a hint of mockery in his words. And Li Yunxin actually knew why he asked this question. The pleasure in the Cool Palace was 8 feet long and 2 feet wide. The painting was the cool palace they had seen before, as well as the lush greenery outside the palace. The flowers and trees, the hall, the cups, and the furniture were all painted very well. Li Yunxin had a solid foundation since he was a child. In terms of painting skills alone, he could be considered a master. But looking at these paintings, he still had to praise them in his heart. But the strange thing was, there was something wrong with the people. At this moment, he could see that they were people. Because of the angle, he could vaguely see the depth of the light and shade. He also knew that the painter actually wanted to boldly try a new technique, to paint a 3-dimensional feeling in such a meticulous painting. However, it seemed that the painter did not have a good grasp of perspective and proportion. Or maybe it was intentional, and wanted to pursue a sense of uniqueness and weirdness. That was why those people looked like strange monsters. In fact, it reminded Li Yunxin of a famous painting in his previous world, The Scream, by the painter named Munch. But now there were many other things added to the painting. It was none other than the little people he had painted with the thin lines before. There were nearly 100 of them, densely lined up on the painting. It was a horrible sight. He stood up and walked closer to look at it for a while. He knew that it was still the work of the art saint. That was why he felt the familiar sense of absurdity before. There was probably no one else in the world who could be as free and unrestrained as her. So he sighed softly. In fact, it is enough to show the skill. He reached out his hand and gently touched the painting. But he was careful not to touch the painting. The characters should be trying new techniques and feelings. Our realms are not as good as hers, so it is normal that we can't see the beauty. But look at the furniture, the flowers and birds, the plants. They are already beyond my reach. Su Sheng turned his face, and suddenly a very strange smile appeared on his face. Chapter 454. Li Yunxin frowned. What's wrong? After a while, Su Sheng said faintly, the furniture, flowers, birds, and plants in this painting are all painted by me. Li Yunxin blinked, and was a little dazed for a moment. He seemed to have thought of something, but the thought was vague. He couldn't figure it out. But soon, he knew what he was thinking about. With a strange smile on his face, Su Sheng continued. So you still don't know. That Chen Zhao is not good at painting at all. After I exposed her, she learned from me for 12 years. The characters in The Pleasure in the Cool Palace are already the peak of her painting skills. Then, he held back his laughter and looked at Li Yunxin. Now you should know, right? Chen Zhao, the person who is the most saint of painting in the world, is not good at it at all. Li Yunxin was dumbfounded. Then, he realized that his thought just now was, from the time he saw the first painting of the art saint until now, it seemed he had never seen her painting seriously. He used to think that it was the saint's extreme pride. She wanted to use simple and childish strokes to bring the painting to perfection and integrate the great Tao into it. But now, he realized, it was not that she didn't want to paint well. Just looking at the painting in front of him that she treasured on the floating mountain, it seemed she still wanted to paint it. He stood there in a daze for a while, not knowing what to say. Seeing him like this, Su Sheng seemed to want to laugh even more. However, since he was not in the painting now, he could only endure it. After all, he felt that he had taken revenge for being scolded hundreds of times in the stone path. Therefore, he smiled with his hands behind his back and paced a few steps in front of the painting. He looked at Li Yunxin. Hey, now, how do you feel about the supreme master of painting disappearing in your heart? But Li Yunxin didn't answer him immediately. Instead, after a while, he suddenly let out a long sigh. The expression on his face changed from dumbfounded to a strange smile. Previously, when Su Sheng asked him about the painting, he had a strange smile on his face. Now that she saw his smile, she was shocked. She stretched out her hand and pushed him. Have you lost your soul? But Li Yunxin ignored him, still smiling and shaking his head. Then he moved closer to the painting and looked at it carefully for a while. Then, clasping his hands behind his back, he began to stroll around the room. Su Sheng furrowed his brows when he saw this, because he was keenly aware that Li Yunxin's temperament had undergone a huge change. In this instant, the last reincarnation met Li Yunxin in Dongting. At that time, he was trapped and surrounded by powerful enemies from Daotong. His situation was not good, but in that kind of situation, when he met Su Wang, he was still able to act neither servile nor overbearing. As for other matters, he seemed to have a well-thought-out plan. That look made Su Sheng really want to see him suffer a setback. This was simply too despicable. Later on, when he met Su Sheng, he did not have the respect that a saint should have. They were like peers when they got along with each other. Then when they arrived at Mount Yunshan and Mount Yunshan, Li Yunxin's temperament changed subtly. In fact, it should be said that it started from tonight. Since Su Sheng told him that the art saint had made those birds, those magic figures, and the little people in the stone path, Li Yunxin restrained his temperament and became conservative in his words. Although he wasn't exactly afraid of the slightest thing, he was different from before. He was just like peddlers and servants in the market would indeed envy the nobles in the capital when they heard that they lived a luxurious life. However, their identities, status, and distance were so far apart that it was difficult for them to have any other feelings except for envy. They could talk about those nobles, and even ridicule them in the fields. But if one day, those ordinary people went on a trip, and met a nobleman, who also went on a trip, and was warmly invited to sit with them, then he would not be able to remain calm. The huge difference in power, wealth, and even manners that had been offset by the sense of distance in the past came crashing down on him like an avalanche, making him smaller and smaller. He was at a loss of what to do, and his words were flustered. Li Yunqin. In the past, he had only heard of the art saint's name and deeds. But now that he was on the floating mountain, he was overwhelmed by the various techniques of the former art saint. Therefore, Su Sheng could feel that his aura had weakened significantly, not to him, but to Chen Zhao. He felt that slowly, in Li Yunqin's eyes, Chen Zhao seemed to become more majestic and mysterious. She was beautiful, powerful, and fearless. Any rumors about her, even those that criticized her as a demon, would only add color to her legend. She was almost a perfect image. Facing a senior with such an image, even Li Yunqin had to bow slightly. Previously, when he followed Su Sheng around the cold hall, he only followed Su Sheng's instructions for almost an hour. It was not that he trusted Su Sheng, but that he respected the art saint's methods, so he did not dare to make any mistakes. If it was the Li Yunqin of the past, he would not be such a careful person. However, this temperament suddenly disappeared without a trace after learning that although Chen Ying was a paragon of painting, his painting skills were truly terrible. At this moment, Li Yunqin had his hands behind his back and started to walk around the room leisurely. After all, a quarter of an hour ago, Su Sheng had seen with his own eyes that when he walked to the white wall to see the music in the cool palace, he carefully avoided the few talismans scattered on the ground. Su Sheng actually remembered those talismans clearly. They were already on this table before he left the floating mountain. They were just useless talismans. Chen Zhao wanted to try something new, but then he lost interest. After he left the Cloud Mountain, the small group of palaces that once belonged to her had been sealed. No one had come here again, and no one had touched her things. Just now, when they rolled onto the table, the useless talismans fell to the ground and were stepped on until they were wrinkled. With Li Yunqin's cultivation, how could he not see whether the talismans were useful or not? However, it was as if he did not dare to confirm the profoundness of it. He took a turn and took 3 steps, trying not to step on them. But now, Li Yunqin stopped and walked around the spacious room, as if he was sightseeing. However, he no longer had his previous timid attitude. Instead, he was his usual style. When he saw something interesting, he immediately flipped through it. When he found something interesting, but was not sure about it, he put it all into his sleeves. The reverence for the art saint's former residence, that might have existed before, was now gone. He was more like a treasure hunter, the boldest and most arrogant kind, treating everything in the room as his own. Su Sheng specialized in the cultivation of lust. Therefore, seeing his change, how could he not know what had happened? This Li Yunqin was enlightened because of his words, and in the blink of an eye, she had crossed a heart tribulation. This guy, how did he do it? What knot did he untie? He was so curious that he could die. It must be known that whether it was when he was a cultivator or now that he was recultivating, it was not easy to go through the heart tribulation. However, this Li Yunqin also seemed to be going through the tribulation, but he did not take the path of the cultivators of Daotong or Kenzo, who abandoned love and lust. He thought of the art saint Chen Zhao, who was also different. As a saint, Chen Zhao did not look like a saint at all, nor did he act like one. Could it be that the art of painting was so mysterious? Since he was itching to know, he naturally asked. But when Li Yunqin heard his question, he only giggled and did not want to answer him. He picked up a small booklet from the bamboo bookshelf and slowly flipped through it. Then his expression changed slightly, and he quickly put the booklet away. Su Sheng also knew what it was. The booklet recorded some of Chen Zhao's cultivation comprehension, which was considered superficial. But for Li Yunqin's current realm, it was just right. But it was only a few words, not a systematic system. After Chun Zhao was expelled from Cloud Mountain, he and Zhuomuja had come to the art saint's residence to check. They disdained to take away or destroy many things, but they knew where they were. Seeing Li Yunxin like this, Su Xing said, "Li Yunxin, I know where the cultivation method you want to cultivate is." After saying this, he snorted again. "But if you want me to give it to you, you have to first." How could Li Yunxin not know what he was talking about? He turned to look at him and sighed. "You are clearly an old guy who is thousands of years old, but now you are so nosy. Fine. If you want to listen, it's not a big deal." He stopped walking and stood beside the bookshelf, looking at Su Sheng. He spread his hands and said, "It's just the things between men and women. In the past, I admired the art saint, so I wanted to get more information about her. So by chance I came to Cloud Mountain. Along the way, I saw all kinds of her magical powers and felt that she was perfect, crushing me in all aspects. I felt a little afraid and depressed. If you say that this is a heart demon, a heart tribulation, it is indeed so. I used to have the state of mind of a grand supreme, but it was broken by this heart tribulation. As for now," speaking of this, Li Yunxin suddenly laughed. "As for now, you have to know, to me, love between men and women is the most unfamiliar kind of emotion. I actually used to be a little afraid. And the person I admired was someone like the art saint, so I was even more afraid. There was a time when I even tied this fear of love with love itself, planning to use some aversion therapy to stop myself from thinking about it. But just now, I suddenly realized that Chun Zhao is not as perfect as I thought." He narrowed his eyes, but there was still a smile in them. "This is not perfect. It is like a crack on a smooth shell. Because of it, it is completely broken. My fear of this kind of love is also broken. If you want to ask me if I have gone through a love tribulation, I think so. But the problem is, it is not just a love tribulation." Li Yunxin took a deep breath and spread his hands. "I have also gone through the fear of love itself. You want to ask me how many tribulations I have gone through? I don't know either." When Su Xing heard this, he did not look relieved. Instead, he looked extremely shocked. "You are saying you love Chun Zhao?" He raised his hand and pointed at him. "She is your ancestor." Li Yunxin smiled. Her smile was relaxed and joyful. There was not the slightest bit of confusion and anxiety in it. "Oh, but I just like her. So what?" Chapter 455. Su Sheng was speechless. He pointed at Chun Zhao. You. But Li Yunxin smiled. "So where is the cultivation method she left behind?" Su Sheng's face turned red as he repeated. "She's your grandmaster. I won't allow this." Li Yunxin pursed his lips. "You don't want to tell me? I'll find it myself. If I can't find it, I won't help you find your body." After saying this, he turned around and started searching the bookshelves again. He muttered something like, "I didn't want to tell you, but you just had to ask." He did not take Su Sheng's feelings to heart. Since this was the residence of the art saint, there must be many powerful restrictions. Even the little things that the saint set up casually were enough to give Li Yunxin a hard time in the realm of true enlightenment. But later, magic was forbidden in this space, so the powerful restrictions lost their effect. Only some less advanced methods, such as the rope trick that Li Yunxin had used to climb the mountain, were left. When encountering such things, he could break them with a little thought. Thus, in just a quarter of an hour, he had already searched through all the books on the shelves. He had gained a lot. Chun Zhao, the art saint, seemed to be very idle. There were many small booklets on the bookshelves, in which some of his experiences were recorded. Li Yunxin did not understand some of them, but he knew that they were not very difficult. As long as he had a good foundation, everything would become clear. The other things that he could understand were actually some ingenious ideas and insights. For example, "I suddenly had an idea today. Could we do this?" Although the previous method failed, the smoke from the mountain's explosion was quite beautiful. Last night, 0A dared to slack off. Today, I'll see if he still dares to slack off after I pull out his brain. And so on. Li Yunxin was not an amateur in painting. He was also very smart. In the past, it was difficult to learn, because it was like building a castle in the air. It was not easy to get started, Now that he had seen so many fragmented realizations, a certain system was swiftly and deftly constructed in his mind. He looked thought and took them. When he put away all the books and booklets with Chun Hua's handwriting on the bamboo bookshelf, he understood some things. Thus, he felt that he understood why there were so few experts in the school of painting back then. It was said that in the past 1,000 years, there hadn't been a single Taoist painter in the profound realm. The one with the highest cultivation was only at the true realm. Moreover, although the school of painting, Daotong, and Kinzo were listed as one of the 3 righteous sects of the profound sect at that time, the number of people in the school of painting was extremely small. It was only equivalent to a sect of Daotong or Kinzo. After all, the school of painting had appeared late, so it was understandable that there were fewer people in the beginning. But the problem was that Chun Zhao had appeared 2,200 years ago. In just 200 years, he had the cultivation of a saint. In the following 1,000 years, the school of painting had developed for a whole 1,000 years. Such a long time, even with the average lifespan of a cultivator, it had gone through more than a dozen generations. Was there no one with outstanding talent? Why did it continue to decline? Until tonight, Li Yunqin felt that he had probably found a reason. The problem with the cultivation method itself. The saint of painting was not good at painting. Painting, the skill of painting. When Li Yunqin first started cultivating the Tao of painting, Li Chunfeng told him that he had to first practice painting skills. A simple principle was that the more realistic the essence, qi, and spirit of the things you drew, the easier it would be to activate the spiritual qi in them. In the early stages of the cultivation of this path, painting skills occupied a very important supporting position. Actually, at that time, Li Yunqin felt that this cultivation method was actually very unfriendly to beginners. For beginners, it was difficult, obscure, and difficult to understand. The artists in the secular world had obtained the Tao of painting that had been lost to the outside world. The most talented ones could only reach the void state, or the transcendent state. Now that he had comprehended the scattered relics left behind by the saint of painting, he finally realized that the problem with this cultivation method was actually with the saint of painting herself. Chen Zhao was very bad at painting. Thus, when she cultivated this cultivation method, she had to put in twice the effort for half the result. Ordinary people probably wouldn't be able to cultivate in this situation. But she was very smart, so she thought of all kinds of crooked ways to go about it. In the end, the cultivation method passed down by Shenmu was modified by Chen Zhao into a method that was only suitable for her to cultivate. Or rather, it was suitable for people who were bad at painting to cultivate. But the original guiding principle didn't change. The more realistic the objects were, and the closer they were to the source, the more beneficial it would be for cultivation. These two strange contradictions overlapped and entangled later on. Cultivators were guided by her, and innocently went down the wrong path. It was supposed to be the easiest cultivation method to understand, but cultivators had to take into account the shape. In the beginning, it would be strange if they could cultivate it well. As for whether Chen Zhao knew all this, actually, Li Yunqin felt that even if she knew, she didn't seem to be someone who liked to teach and educate people. Moreover, what could she say even if she knew? Because I only know how to draw circular heads and stick-like claws. There's something wrong with my technique. Don't follow my method. As for how it came about, I can't be bothered to study it. She wouldn't do that. Thinking of this, Li Yunqin suddenly laughed. Su Sheng, who was standing at the side, was even more annoyed when he saw this. If he was still the saint of the past, he wouldn't care about these things. But in this life, he had started to cultivate lust, so he didn't have a heart as still as water. Plus, he didn't know why, but there was some kind of pent-up anger in his heart that he couldn't bear to see this happen. Thus, he chanted a spell to Li Yunqin. You're actually laughing. I know you're carefree and unrestrained, but there's always a limit to everything. As the saying goes, even a vicious tiger won't eat its cubs. Even a despicable bandit wouldn't do something to himself. Hey, Li Yunqin, you'd better give up. Previously, when Li Yunqin was searching the bookshelves and thinking slowly, Su Sheng had been muttering to him. Now that he interrupted Li Yunxin's train of thought, he frowned. He turned around and stared at Su Sheng seriously for a while. Old comrade, let me ask you, which generation of calligrapher were you in the past? Su Sheng was stunned and didn't respond for a moment. Li Yunxin snorted. The 259th generation of calligrapher, right? Let me ask you again, which generation of sword saint was Zhuomuja? Without waiting for him to answer, Li Yunxin snorted again. The 214th generation of sword saint, right? He clapped his hands. Ha! Daotong and Kenzo both belong to the Xianmen. In fact, the difference in their names is only a difference in their skills. The people of Kenzo are respectful when they see the masters of Daotong, while the masters of Daotong are trembling when they see the sword saint. In essence, they're all the same. What about you? You got together with the saints who are 45 generations older than you, and even had a child and a family. Why are you pretending to be a little white flower here? He didn't speak at all, but once he did, he was really mean. He didn't care that he was dragged into it. According to the secular world, Su Yusong, the calligrapher, and Zhuomuja, the sword saint, were indeed his ancestors. In terms of sharp-tongued, few people in the world could compare to him. Su Sheng was a little stunned by his words. After a while he said in a low voice, "How long ago was that? Later on we became saints. How can ordinary human relationships compare?" Li Yunxin spread out his hands, turned around and continued to search. But he didn't stop talking. Ah yes. In your world, it's not something that can be measured by ordinary human relationships. In my world, it's treacherous. He picked up a porcelain bottle the size of a palm and looked at it. Suddenly, a thin arm stretched out from the bottle and pretended to gouge his eyes. At the same time, it scolded in a soft voice. "What are you looking at, you stinking hooligan?" Li Yunxin put the bottle into his sleeve and raised his hand to fiddle with an unknown flower that had not yet withered on the table. "But if you really want to be serious, let me tell you this. My soul, you don't need to know why, has nothing to do with you. My body is not the body that was born in the past. Now it's dragons. So in fact I have nothing to do with Su Yusong or Zhuomuja." The so-called Li Yunxin he. He fiddled with it for a while, put away the flower, and turned to look at Su Sheng. "I want to say that I'm Li Yunxin, and I'm Li Yunxin. I want to say that I'm a big demon, and I'm a big demon. What ethics? Old mister. Is it because I'm too much like a human these days?" He stared at Su Sheng gloomily, revealing 2 rows of slightly sharp teeth, and smiled ferociously. "So, you have forgotten that I'm actually a monster that eats people." Su Sheng was stunned. Then, his expression turned serious. Now, although he was Su Sheng, although he was a young man, although he also had many desires that secular people had, he still had the memory of the 259th master of calligrapher. So, now that he was threatened by Li Yunxin in such words, the pride in his heart that belonged to the master of calligrapher rose again. He no longer muttered. Instead, he straightened his body and put one hand behind his back. His aura instantly became deep and firm. "Li Yunxin, are you threatening me?" However, Li Yunxin sneered, turned around and continued to do his own things. Su Sheng was silent for a while, and said in a low voice, "You have to know that she is the art saint. As for me and Zhuomuja, you also have to know that we are both saints. The saint is not just a cultivation realm, nor is it just a cultivator. It also means the honor of the celestial sect. You love her, but you can hide it in your heart. But have you ever thought that are you worthy of a saint?" Li Yunxin's back was facing him, and his movements stopped. But soon, he continued to flip through the paper. "So it's because of this?" "What?" Su Sheng frowned. Chapter 456. Li Yunxin fiddled with it for a while. He picked up some of the papers and put them away before turning to look at him. "Are you unhappy?" He raised his hand and gestured. "For example, who do you think you are to admire a saint? When we were with the painting saint on Yunshan, we didn't even know where you were. Now, you have come to a place like this and say in front of me that you admire a saint. Are you unhappy because of these things?" Su Sheng furrowed his brows again. "Nonsense. You have to understand." However, Li Yunxin took a step toward him. The soles of his shoes stepped on the bamboo floor. A clatter interrupted his words. I suddenly remembered something. When you Su Sheng's reincarnation saw me, you mentioned to me more than once that you were my ancestor. At the time, I didn't pay attention. Only now do I realize that your words had the meaning of don't look at how impressive you are now, but I am your ancestor. Su Sheng's brows furrowed even tighter. Then he smiled. Looking at it, it was as if he was so angry that he smiled. Why would I have these thoughts? At this point, he was interrupted by Li Yunxin. Then here comes the problem. Your reincarnation said that you wanted to experience the worries of the world. How long has it been since you experienced the tribulation with this body until now? How many tribulations have you experienced? The change in his words was abrupt, but it was also his usual style. It was difficult for others to keep up with his strange thoughts, so they could only blindly follow his lead. Su Sheng stared at him suspiciously for a while. Suddenly his brows relaxed. He seemed to have thought of something. After a moment of silence, he said in a low voice, 5 or 6 years. I've experienced many surging worries. Li Yunxin took another step closer to him and stared at him seriously. When you were in the Qing army camp, you told me that the surging worries drowned you and made you unable to pull yourself out. At the time, I already had something I wanted to ask you, but I didn't. But today, I really want to ask. In the past, you went from being emotional to being emotionless and experienced many long and boring years that normal people could not endure. After that, he used the memories of the saints to create a tribulation body and descended to the mortal world to experience the tribulation. Such a tribulation body, be it temperament or willpower, is definitely not something an ordinary person can compare to. And if you want to talk about sorrow, there are many weak mortals in the world who lost their parents when they were born and have been abused since they were young. After growing up, he finally found a trace of warmth, but it was snatched away in the blink of an eye. Having no way to seek help, having no way out, and having tasted the indifference and contempt of the world, these fragile mortals can still keep their hearts intact after experiencing such hardships. How did you lose yourself in just a few years? You're a sage who has been cultivating for thousands of years. Su Sheng opened his mouth, but no words came out. Li Yunxin paused and sighed. I didn't think too much about it. I thought you should know a lot of things. But when I saw you lose your composure just now, I suddenly realized, maybe I'm in this mountain. If you can be lost because of other things, you can also be lost because of this. Su Yusong, have you ever thought of this possibility? In fact, you have already experienced all the tribulations that can be experienced. But there are still some things that you can never experience in the mortal world. Su Sheng's throat trembled, and his mouth gurgled. He could not speak. It was as if he could not control his excitement, and was finally about to obtain what he had been longing for a long time. What is it? He asked in a low voice. Li Yunxin looked at him calmly. When you reached the saint's emotionless state, you are already at the peak of the mortal world. In terms of cultivation and magical power, you are the strongest in this world. In terms of power and wealth, you are the most prosperous in this world. As a saint, you have no sorrow or joy. Only mortals respect you as an immortal, and cultivators respect you as a god. There is no reason for you to envy or be jealous of them. After you entered the tribulation with this body, maybe you can feel a lot of emotions. But there is one thing that is extremely difficult for you to understand, right? That is the feeling of jealousy that I was talking about just now. Jealousy is also one of the 8 sufferings of the world. However, what in this world can make you have such feelings? No one in the world is worthy of it. Although you have no magical power, you can borrow the power of heaven and earth. The cultivators today are just your disciples and grand disciples. And the wandering souls of the Freemasonry are even less worthy of your attention. You also have the memories of your previous life, and you know that those powerful people today are just ants in your eyes. Until Li Yunxin laughed. You found that there is a person in this world who has a method that you never knew, and he used that method to pull your clear consciousness out of the ocean of sorrow, and not just once. And then this person, this smart, handsome, and invincible young man, also fell in love with someone who was once a saint like you. You and she both have the status of a saint. You are angry because that person fell in love with the art saint. In fact, you can't even tell if it is because of this, or because you actually benefited from his method and became someone who needs his help. A mere child actually has such ability, and now he even wants to enter our honorable and unparalleled class. You are jealous of me, afraid of me, and think that I am someone who is on par with you, right? Su Sheng's lips trembled violently. He blinked his eyes quickly and stared straight at Li Yunxin, muttering to himself, I indeed never thought of this. Because the current you is not the real you. Li Yunxin sighed. The real Su Sheng who went through the tribulation, even if he had such feelings for me, he would suppress it, because of his former pride and self-esteem. Everything would be well concealed, and even he would not be aware of it. He would not be like you just now, meddling in other people's business, just because I said I loved the art saint. You would be pestering me endlessly, because the current you will laugh when you are happy, and cry when you are sad. If you are jealous or dissatisfied, you will say it. These are all things that happen at the subconscious level. You are just expressing them instinctively. So this bitterness. Li Yunxin looked at him with a smile. Now I have helped you experience it. What you said before helped me pass the tribulation of love. What I said after that also helped you complete this tribulation. In the past, when I was cultivating, someone always talked to me about the fruit of fate, but I never really understood it. Tonight, I finally know that this thing called the fruit of fate really exists. He shook his head again and smiled. It is very mysterious, very wonderful, very mysterious. Su Sheng stood there in a daze for half an hour, and the surprise on his face finally disappeared. He let out a long breath, and his whole body relaxed because of this breath, as if many things in his body had been emptied. Li Yunxin, you. He looked at him seriously. I have never seen a person like you. You will definitely have a boundless future. Li Yunxin smiled. This kind of irrefutable universal truth. You don't need to repeat it in such a serious tone. Then now, tell me, where is the cultivation method left by the art saint? Su Sheng did not reply to his witty words. Instead, he continued to say seriously, Today you helped me to achieve the tribulation body, but the fruit of fate is not finished yet. In the future, I will definitely repay you, but you have to behave yourself, be careful in everything you do, and don't be too unreasonable when you do things. After hearing his words, Li Yunxin stopped smiling. He suddenly frowned and stared at him carefully for a while. Suddenly his expression changed. Su Sheng continued. The cultivation method left by the art saint is naturally with Taoist Danqing. If you have a chance to leave this little cloud mountain, you can go there to look for it. What you want is not a profound painting method. They won't be so heavily guarded. With your intelligence, it shouldn't be difficult to secretly take it. Sigh. Chapter 457. The smile on Su Sheng's face froze. It was not only his smile that froze, but also his movements. He was supposed to fall slowly, but his arms were grabbed by Li Yunxin in a weird posture. Now he was standing on the ground in this posture like a statue. However, his face could still move. He glanced at the two fake saints, and his expression changed countless times. Finally he sighed, alas. This sigh was not because of anything else, but because he did not tell Li Yunxin before. On the stone path, Li Yunxin asked him why he could still use his supernatural power to suppress those little people in the stone when he was fighting with the art saint after the supernatural power was banned in Mount Shaoyan. But at that time, he was suffering from jealousy after being exposed by Li Yunxin. Naturally, he did not want to tell Li Yunxin. He did not expect that now, the wandering soul, whom he thought would never be able to master this technique, actually did it. He used his physical body to perform this divine ability again. Using his own way of doing things to himself, he suppressed his culpa body. The fruit of sin. The fruit of sin. Tonight, the fake saints looked like Su Yusong and Zhuomuja. Su Yusong was an old man with white hair and beard, but his beard was neatly trimmed. 5 long strands of beard fluttered in the wind, as smooth as silk brocade. His white hair was combed into a Taoist bun. There was not even a strand of hair on his temples or forehead. It was as if he was painted. Although there were wrinkles on his face, they did not look old or ugly. Instead, they looked like they were cut by knives and axes, which made him look calm and steady. Zhuomuja was even more so. He was already beautiful. With a little makeup, he would look elegant and dignified. Even though the two of them were dressed in casual clothes, it did not conceal the nobility in their speech and actions. But looking at Su Sheng's words, when Li Yunxin first met him in the wine shop, he looked like a drunkard. His hair was messy, and his clothes were loose. Although the tribulation body of the innate saint was not filthy, after experiencing so many days in his sleeve, fighting, running, dodging, and even dying, he was already in a sorry state just by looking at his appearance. Li Yunxin, on the other hand, was still fresh and handsome. His human body was transformed from the body of a demon. With just a thought, his white clothes, red lips, and white teeth would appear. There was no need to worry too much. Therefore, among the four of them, it was the reincarnation of the sage of calligrapher, who had the greatest supernatural power, and was the one who looked the most miserable. And that was indeed the case. It was unknown how long Su Yusong and Zhuomuja had been lying in ambush outside. Now that Su Sheng had entered the room, he waved his hand at Li Yunxin and said, "Dragon King, there is no need to panic. I said that Dragon King is our honored guest, so we won't be rude to him. On the other hand, thanks to Dragon King's efforts, he finally helped us capture this divine soul that escaped." Su Sheng squinted at Li Yunxin. Li Yunxin spread out his hands expressionlessly and said, "It's none of my business." While they were talking, the two fake saints had walked into the room. Zhuomuja's eyes only briefly swept over the two. Then he walked to the bamboo table and sat down, flipping through a few booklets on the table. These booklets were taken out by Li Yunxin, but he did not take them away. She only took a few glances and shook her head. "I have seen these things long ago. Now you treat them as treasures." As she said this, she looked up at Li Yunxin and said, "If you really want these, why don't you ask Shilio for them? That child loves you, so there is no reason for her to refuse you." Li Yunxin smiled and said, "It is only comfortable to use things that are stolen with one's own ability. Don't you feel the same?" Su Yusong's eyes also stayed on the booklets for a while. Then he looked at Li Yunxin and said, "Dragon King, sneaked into the floating mountain for these? Didn't Dragon King have the illuminating jade slip? Is there no cultivation method of the painting school in it?" Li Yunxin smiled again. "I won't tell you." Su Yusong also smiled as if he was treating a naughty child. "Well, we will talk about our business later." But he turned to look at Su Sheng. But it seemed that he was still talking to Li Yunxin. When Dragon King was in the Lord Dongting Mountain, he met an old man who called himself Su Wang. Tan Liang reported this to me. Tan Liang. Dragon King should be familiar with him. He was the water monster Li Shan in Dongting at that time. Oh, later, he was brought back to Yunshan by Quan Wuzi. Li Yunxin answered. "That's why we all know how miraculous that old man is." Su Yusong said slowly, "We originally cultivated many forces in the states and counties near Dongting. Of course, I didn't pay attention to these small things before. They were all done by others. However, later I heard that Dragon King was in Dongting, so I wanted to investigate it. Then I found Su Wang, who had stayed in the Su family near Dongting for decades, had another identity." "Ha!" He looked at Su Sheng. "That year, we won your physical body, but your soul escaped. We have been searching for it for 1,000 years, but to no avail. In the end, we found it with the help of Dragon King Li. But your reincarnated body soon met the tribulation. I could only wait patiently. But finally, I got a clue. Dragon King you." He turned to look at Li Yunxin again. "The sage will not favor anyone casually. Su Wen could get in touch with you, so the reincarnated body was more likely to find you. So we waited patiently, until we got the news from somewhere, that there was another reincarnated body of the sage of calligrapher in the human world. Then we decided to give it a try." Su Yusong rubbed his hands. "I said that I would send a set of Taoist instruments to Dragon King with the help of golden light. That's what I was thinking about. If the Dragon King, and the other reincarnated bodies of the Sage of Calligrapher are still in contact. It means that the Dragon King is also an important role in the heart of the Sage of Calligrapher, and he will never let you die. Then, facing the situation where golden light came with the Taoist instruments, would the reincarnated body of the Sage of Calligrapher still not take action? As a result, you really subdued the Taoist instruments. Alas, my painstaking efforts were not in vain. Tonight, Muja and I waited patiently for 6 days. And the Dragon King finally brought the sage to the floating mountain. It was also a big surprise for us. If the Dragon King did not bring the sage to Yunshan, our Taoist instruments would have been wasted. So thank you, Dragon King, for your help. After he said these words, Li Yunxin stopped smiling. He frowned slightly. You mean you led me into the trap and led the reincarnated body of the Sage of Calligrapher? So in fact, I have been your bait? Dragon King, don't say that. Su Yusong frowned. Our friendship with the Dragon King is real. How can we belittle ourselves? But Li Yunxin frowned more tightly. You know that Su Weng contacted me in Dongting. So you speculated that this reincarnated body may also be related to me. Therefore, you wanted to use me to lead him to Yunshan. What if he did not come? What if I did not bring him here? Su Yusong smiled gently. This kind of question should not be asked by the Dragon King. You are also a resourceful person, and you must know that no plan is perfect, certain, and inevitable. It was a surprise that the Dragon King brought him here. The fact that the Dragon King did not bring him here, or that he did bring him here, and that he did not try to boldly walk into the floating mountain without being noticed by us. It's only a matter of time before we spend more time and effort to continue to look for him slowly. It does not affect the overall situation. After he said that, Li Yunxin didn't say anything else. His face was very pale. It seemed that he never thought that one day he would be used as a bait. He did not realize that he was tricked until the end. And the person who set him up seemed to have fought with him many times. Since he left the mountain village, the Freemasonry seemed to have been watching him. Seeing his rare depressed look, Zhuomuja looked at him a few more times. Then she smiled, shook her head, and continued to read the booklet in her hand. Since Li Yunxin did not say anything, Su Yusong turned to look at Su Sheng. So, I want to ask you, what made the sage value Li Yunxin so much? When he came to Yunshan, you even worried about his safety. Why did you come here to wait for him and keep him safe? His words stunned Li Yunxin again. He turned to look at Su Sheng subconsciously. He was a smart person. How could he not understand what Su Yusong meant? It was not a coincidence that he met Su Sheng in the wine shop before. And it was not a coincidence that he met Su Weng in Dongting earlier. It was the former sage who deliberately contacted him. This time, Su Sheng knew that Li Yunxin was going to Yunshan. He was worried that Li Yunxin would suffer, so he created a chance encounter and gave Li Yunxin a lot of benefits. Since this idea came into his mind, Li Yunxin thought about what happened a few days ago. If Su Sheng was not there, maybe he had been seriously injured when fighting with the golden photon, and it would have been more difficult for him to take those treasures left by the sage. This result was indeed within his expectation, killing the golden photon and then going to Yunshan. But if he had been seriously injured, would the two fake sages on Yunshan still treat him so politely? And would Ku Chanzi, who was present before, let him go so easily? Li Yunxin opened his mouth, took a deep breath, and looked at Su Sheng. Su Sheng, who was suppressed, was just one step away from him. But Li Yunxin looked at him, as if he was looking at a stranger. Maybe there should be some gratitude and enthusiasm in his eyes. But at this moment, there was no such thing in his eyes. Instead, there was a little fear mixed with some disgust. It was hard to say what kind of look it was. It was only known that when Li Yunxin's eyes met Su Sheng's, he immediately withdrew them. Not only did he withdraw his eyes, but he also took 2 steps back, tripped over the bamboo chair, and sat on it in a daze. He stared blankly at the bamboo floor, not saying a word. Su Sheng, who was frozen, sighed again when he saw him like this. Alas. Li Yunxin sat down, only 1 table away from Zhuomuja. But he didn't care at all. Zhuomuja looked at him and said to Su Yusong with a smile, "Look, This child has been teased like this by you. I'm afraid his heart is like dead water. Alas, it's no wonder. I heard from Shilio. As he spoke, he glanced at Li Yunxin from the corner of his eyes. He has always boasted that he is resourceful and ambitious. I think he was not convinced by us in the past, so he came to Cloud Mountain, planning to find a way out of danger, and also vent his anger at being schemed against by us. Now he knows that he has been schemed against by us, and many of his previous methods were only effective because someone was secretly watching over him. How can he not feel sad? But Su Yusong smiled tolerantly like an honest elder. It's a good thing. Didn't we say that he was a good seedling to refine into a wandering soul? But now that we have brought the saint here, we don't need him for this. After getting the method to reconstruct the tribulation body of the 6 desires from our saint, isn't it the best material to refine the saint's tribulation body into a wandering soul? Since Shilio admires him, I'll ask him later, but he is convinced. If he is convinced and is willing to work with us, you and I will be happy, and Shilio will also be happy. The two of them decided Li Yunxin's fate, as if there was no one else around. But Li Yunxin didn't even say a word. Su Xing finally opened his mouth at this time. I'm afraid it won't be so easy. As soon as he opened his mouth, Su Yusong finally let out a long sigh. Sigh. You finally spoke. Originally, before I fixed you in place, I was afraid that you hated me in your heart and wouldn't speak. Actually, back then, I served you as a scholar, and was by your side for nearly 100 years. You did take good care of me. You treated me like a human. Hearing this, Su Xing snorted coldly. Human? Back then, I was at the Grand Supreme Realm. Even if you were a dog, I saw that you were no different from a human. You thought that I treated you like a human. But how do you know that I didn't treat you like a dog? Su Yusong was slightly stunned. Then he laughed and looked at Zhuomuja. Look, now that the saint can get angry, I feel much closer to him. I used to think that after we took your body, you would definitely hate me in your heart. I really wanted to see what the cold and heartless saint looked like when he hated people. Now that I've seen it, it can be considered that my life wasn't in vain. These 2 wandering souls who had taken the body of the saint had now fixed the original owner of the body in place. They spoke with confidence and assurance, as if everything was under their control. This situation was equivalent to a bandit killing an entire family, and then taking the only survivor back to the house to be a servant. It was a terrible humiliation. However, in the face of such humiliation, Su Xing sneered. A villain is just arrogant for a moment because of his success. You ask me why I care about him? It's because in the end, all of you might die in his hands. Daotong and Kenzo have existed for more than 50,000 years. The twists and turns and dangers in between are not something you 2 lonely ghosts can imagine. Who knows how many times you've been in a dangerous situation like today? Even if you steal my body for 1,000 years and control the Xianmen for 1,000 years, compared to the long history, it's just a moment. You can be arrogant today. In the future, once you lose power, I know what you're going to say, Su Yusong suddenly said, interrupting Su Sheng's words. The smile on his face grew wider, as if he was watching a wonderful performance. Because this performance was extremely rare, he had to speak and do things slowly so that he could savor the wonderful taste and not have regrets when he recalled it later. In this situation today, you still have such high hopes for Li Yunxin. Let me think about it. Su Yusong put his hands behind his back and paced on the ground, as if he was deep in thought. Think about it. He's already in our hands. Why can you still say such words? What are you relying on? They were talking about Li Yunxin, but Li Yunxin still did not speak. It was as if he had really lost his fighting spirit and was disheartened. But Zhuomuja looked up at him, and Su Yusong also shifted his gaze to him. For a moment, the room was extremely quiet, and even the chirping of the insects outside became clearer. After the time it took for half an incense stick to burn, Su Yusong walked to Li Yunxin and stopped. He looked down at him, and the smile on his face slowly turned cold. It's rare to meet such a smart person like you who is also good at acting. I actually want to see more. For example, your current disheartened look is very interesting. It reminds me of the past. When Yacheong was young, she did something bad. She thought she was very smart and pretended to be innocent. But she didn't know that we had already seen through it. But just didn't say it. But she was still a child at that time. Now seeing you. Wei River Dragon King Li Yunxin again. Playing childish tricks in front of us. It's more funny than cute. Su Yusong was silent for a while. And his voice also turned cold. Li Yunxin, when you were in the city of Wei, you plotted to kill Long Jiuziwen. And then used the city of Wei as a scroll to paint yourself. Then you used the yang qi of 300,000 people in the city of Wei to reconstruct your fiend god body and became the dragon son today. Do you think you can hide it from the whole world? He said these words slowly and coldly. Li Yunxin's body finally stiffened. He raised his head and looked at him. But there was no emotion in Su Yusong's eyes, only cold light. You are a smart person. You should know that you can't hide it from the whole world. Thus this time, before this scheme was seen through by others and completely lost its value, he planned to use it once more. So you set up a wider array in the wilderness forest. Then you came to Cloud Mountain. Relying on your array, you were fearless and unafraid of death. What you did was to get as much information as possible before you died, to gain some benefits. Then you died in front of us, using the souls of countless cultivators and demons on the battlefield to reconstruct your dragon body for the second time, and even advance to a higher realm, right? Li Yunxin opened his mouth. The previous disheartened look on his face was completely gone. But what replaced it was even more intense shock and disbelief. This expression only appeared for a moment. The next moment, he suddenly raised his hand and was about to chop his forehead. But Su Yusong didn't move and only spat out 2 words coldly. That array has been destroyed by us. Now you want to use that array to escape? Humph. I'm afraid that once you die, you will really die. Li Yunxin's hand stopped in front of his forehead. His arm trembled violently, as if he was hesitating whether to do it or not. But after 3 breaths, he sighed dejectedly and put down his hand. His body also collapsed on the chair. She was truly paralyzed. Chapter 458. Zhuomuja glanced at him and smiled. Then, he lowered his head and continued to read the books. Seeing him like this, Su Yusong turned around and walked away without saying anything else. It was as if he wanted to let Li Yunxin have a good taste of failure. So Li Yunxin looked at Su Sheng in confusion. Su Sheng looked at him as well. It was as if he was trying to determine if he was acting, or if he had been seen through. After a dozen breaths, Su Sheng's expression changed. He frowned. You have been seen through. After a while, Li Yunxin bowed on the chair and sat up straight. He spread his hands at Su Sheng without saying a word. They had been together for a few days. Su Sheng already knew why he did this. He was slightly stunned and suddenly shouted, "What do you look like now? You can't recover from a small setback." But Li Yunxin waved his hand weakly and interrupted him. Then, he stood up with his hands on the armrests of the bamboo chair and looked at Su Sheng. He seemed to want to say many things, but stopped himself. In the end he just sighed. I can't recover from a small setback. After saying this, he waved his sleeves. A pile of trinkets fell on the table. But they were not the things that belonged to the art saint. Instead, they were the more precious magic treasures that belonged to the Yunshan saint. The set of Taoist artifacts. I can afford to play, but I can also afford to lose. As he said this, he picked up the magic treasures one by one and wiped away the mark he left on them. Then he placed them in front of Zhuomuja. He was going to hand over all the magic treasures he had with him. How could Su Sheng not know the meaning of this? He immediately widened his eyes. Li Yunxin, what nonsense are you talking about? How can these evil people give you any benefits? Didn't you see how they humiliated me? How can you bear to be a prisoner with such a temperament? You are a complete disappointment to me. But he was interrupted again by Li Yunxin. He turned to look at Su Sheng and sighed again. I'm not talking nonsense. And I think you seem to have some misunderstanding about me. When I say I can afford to play, I'm not afraid of death. If there's something I can do, I'll try to do it. For example, I came to the lair of the bad guys in Yunshan. Mr. Su, to be honest, who wouldn't disappoint you and do what I did? Li Yunxin looked at Su Sheng's expression. Su Sheng's eyes were indeed filled with disappointment. He wondered if one of his previous incarnations had experienced this kind of emotion. He shook his head again and laughed self-mockingly. Being able to afford to lose means, as long as there is a chance to turn the tables, I will continue to play. But now, Sai, in the past, my previous plans were already the pinnacle of what I could achieve with my intelligence. I know I've tried my best, but I still can't beat them. That means his skills are not as good as others. There was nothing to be ashamed of. I admit defeat. Li Yunxin smiled again and touched his sleeves again. He took out the talismans he had written at the foot of the mountain, the scattered magic tools, the magic brush and paper, and arranged them on the table one by one. Su Sheng's face was ashen after listening to his words. He gritted his teeth and said in a trembling voice, You, I misjudged you. You are a coward who is afraid of death. Li Yunxin paused and was silent for a while. Su Yusong and Zhuomuja, on the other hand, did not say anything. They simply watched Li Yunxin slowly hand over the treasures on her body and listened to their conversation. They seemed to be interested in what was going on. Then Li Yunxin smiled again. He looked at Su Sheng and spread his hands. There's nothing wrong with what you said. Who would be willing to die if they could live? Mr. Su, he said with some regret. You used to be a saint, but you were taken over by them. You have the moral responsibility of inheriting the legacy of Daotong and Kenzo. Therefore, you cannot live under the same sky with them. I understand and admire your persistence. But I am just a child. I am only 15 or 16 years old this year. He tilted his head. Originally, I only wanted to cultivate to become an immortal and live a long life. It would be best if I could travel the world and taste all kinds of delicious food. It's just that I've been dragged into the battle between you experts. At first, no one cared about me. I couldn't breathe. So I was angry. I thought we should have some fun. But now, I have no way out. I have no reason to die. He smiled bitterly. Everything I have done all this time is to live. If I came here for the purpose of living, I have no choice but to seek death. Is there something wrong with my brain? Think about it carefully. Don't you think it makes sense? He looked at Su Sheng. I have never had any responsibility or position to speak of. Su Sheng opened his mouth, but no words came out. Because it seemed true, what Li Yunxin said was the truth. He was not a member of the Celestial Sect or the Freemasonry. He was also not a member of the demons. The only thing he was involved in was the death of his parents. However, his father was the successor of the painting sect. When it came to the painting path and the painting saint, the Celestial Sect and the Freemasonry were all dirty. Li Yunxin, the guy who almost stirred up the whole world, did not seem to have any position. It was just that many people had overlooked this point. After 2 breaths, Su Sheng closed his eyes. His mouth was closed, and there was no longer any anger on his face. He no longer had any expectations for Li Yunxin. Or, he had accepted what he said. Li Yunxin turned to look at Su Yusong. He first took out the misty slave de Kai Di Mao, and the along the river, during the Qingming festival. Finally, he took out the misty lock-toed palace. What I said just now is the truth. He looked straight into Su Yusong's eyes and said seriously, I don't want to die. Now that you have the reincarnation of the Saint of Calligraphy, you have a reason not to let me die. Everything I did in the past was for the sake of living. There is no irreconcilable hatred between me and your organization. Since I came to Cloud Mountain, the 2 saints have always treated me with courtesy. There is no need to seek death. I am a smart, pragmatic, and adaptable person. The 2 of you must have recognized these valuable qualities of mine long ago. That is why you have kept me alive. So I think. Li Yunxin put the misty lock-toed palace in front of Su Yusong. Your organization is very suitable for my development. I hope I can get a chance in your organization. Give me a chance today and tomorrow. I will give you a surprise. Su Yusong and Zhuomuja blinked and exchanged glances. Although their expressions were normal, the 2 of them seemed to, had they ever seen such a guy? Admitting his failure was clean and neat, and there was a bit of heroism. But in the blink of an eye, he said that he did it because he wanted to live and did not want to die. He could let bygones be bygones. But then, he turned to the person who was his mortal enemy just a quarter of an hour ago and said, "Please join us." The two of them did not know how to describe this Li Yunxin anymore. In fact, there was no way to describe him. Su Yusong stared at Li Yunxin for a few breaths. Then he picked up the misty lock-toed palace. He casually looked at it and put it down. "You should have a few wandering souls of my organization in your hands." "Ah, those senior and junior brothers are also in this misty lock-toed palace." Li Yunxin immediately answered. "I have never bullied or mistreated them. They are also very tight-lipped. It shows that my organization's style is firm, and my strength is unfathomable." Su Yusong coughed. This Li Yunxin had already started to call himself senior and junior brothers, and my organization. This kind of tone and intonation, no matter who it was, would make people feel that it was fake and pretentious. But now that it came out of his mouth, everyone knew that he was purposely trying to curry favor, and was shamelessly magnanimous and exaggerated. But because of this, they did not know what to say. He seemed to be such a person, but he had never acted according to common sense. He was definitely not a normal person. Zhuomuja frowned slightly. He seemed to unintentionally look outside, then turned his head to look at Li Yunxin. He said lazily, "Li Yunxin, these things you've handed over are just some playthings that don't matter. If you really want to join us, the translucent jade slip has been handed over to Xi and Shilio." On the way to Cloud Mountain, Li Yunxin answered without hesitation and smiled naturally. "If she didn't hand that thing over to you too, she is undoubtedly a spy of Munanju." Su Yusong silently looked at Zhuomuja. Zhuomuja was stunned, as if he did not expect Li Yunxin to blurt out these words so straightforwardly. Then he sneered. Good. Shilio, did you hear that? Did you see what kind of person your lover is?" As soon as he finished speaking, the curtain was lifted. Xi and Shilio walked in quickly and stared at Li Yunxin. She walked 2 steps in front of him and stood still. "Li Yunxin, you already knew that I was a member of the Freemasonry, didn't you?" Li Yunxin was stunned at first. Then he opened his mouth and raised his hands to salute. It's little junior sister. So I was lucky to hand over the translucent jade slip to little junior sister." Xi and Shilio's eyes widened. "You didn't know. You didn't know. Don't you know? If you really don't know, what you said just now is putting me at death's door." Li Yunxin thought for a while and frowned. "Then should I know? Lies. Lies. What he said were all lies. I saw you clearly." Xi and Shilio was enraged like a little lioness. She grabbed the broken pieces on the table and threw them at Li Yunxin's face. But how strong was Li Yunxin's body? He didn't even leave a white mark. He straightened up inside. Before this, everyone was just playing for their own master. What's real or fake? But I'll give you a word. Most relationships that start with deceit don't end well. Junior sister, remember this. Xi and Shilio was even angrier after he said this. He looked around and saw a precious sword hanging on the wall as an ornament. She pulled it out and stabbed it directly at Li Yunxin's chest. "I'll kill you." But the sword was broken. She was a cultivator who was not good at fighting and had forbidden supernatural powers. How could she hurt a demon in the advanced perfected master realm? Zhuomuja sighed. "Shilio, that's enough. This kind of person isn't worth your pain." Xi and Shilio took the broken sword and scratched on Li Yunxin's body. Finally she burst into tears. She threw the broken sword on the ground and ran out while crying. Li Yunxin looked at Su Yusong awkwardly. "This kind of thing, no one wants to do. What can I do?" Zhuomuja acted like a mother-in-law who cared about her daughter. Su Yusong, on the other hand, behaved like a father-in-law who did not show his emotions on his face. Other than a brief moment of pride after he immobilized Su Sheng, he remained calm and collected the rest of the time. He looked like a schemer, as if he was still seriously considering Li Yunxin. When Li Yunxin said this, he smiled noncommittally. "I thought I had to spend a lot of effort and use all kinds of temptations and threats to subdue you. In that case, although I felt a little regretful that you lost your integrity, I would still be happy that I got a general. But looking at you now, either you haven't really surrendered and still want to resist stubbornly, or I really misjudged you. You actually don't have integrity. Speaking of which, I hope it's the former. In this way, even if I have to kill you, I can still see an outstanding and romantic person. Then tell me again, is your situation the former or the latter? His expression was stern and his words were solemn. Li Yunxing could only sigh helplessly and ask himself to lower his voice. I have already done this much. There is nothing to prove. Whether you believe me or not, it's up to you, Saint. But I also want to ask you something. When I first came to Cloud Mountain, you told me that what you wanted to do was to preserve as much power as possible after the Celestial Gate of Wonders collapsed. Now, I want to confirm again. Is this true? Su Yusong thought for a while, and his eyes drifted over Su Sheng. Yes, he said in a low voice. I have been a saint for 1,000 years. Many of my experiences can't be described in detail. But I was also a human before, not a monster. In the past 1,000 years, I have seen people. The rise and fall of the human world, the change of dynasties. The elders don't care about the people of the world. It is us who deal with them. I have watched the people of the world for a long time on Yunshan Mountain. They have become mine. They have become mine. He spoke of perhaps meant, they have become my responsibility. Li Yunxing could understand this. It wasn't like there weren't similar examples in the secular world. In the 46th year of Qingqi in the Qing calendar, an inconceivable case occurred in Huzhou. It was said that after many people reported for many years, it was finally discovered that the Huzhou magistrate, third-level official Zheng Daozhao, had been impersonated. The reason this matter was inconceivable was because he had been the magistrate for 9 years and had been a magistrate for 5 years. Even earlier, he had been a county magistrate for 11 years. When the case occurred, Zheng Daozhao was already 50 years old. 50 years old. For the people of this era, it was indeed old. The truth of the matter was that this so-called Zheng Daozhao's real name was Su Dimeo. Su Dimeo was a scholar who had tried many times without fail. When he was in his 20s, he was really poor and made up his mind to become a bandit. In reality, he was similar to Lu Gongzan. What was different was that Su Dimeo could see blood. Although he was also a military advisor, when he killed people, he was even more vicious than those fierce-looking bandits. Very quickly, he became the master of a stronghold. One year, this group of people robbed and killed a scholar and his 2 attendants. When they inspected the belongings, they found that the scholar was called Zheng Daozhao and was already 28 years old. 4 years ago, he had become a scholar and waited for 4 years to bribe people everywhere before he finally found a position. It was a remote county magistrate. Killing an official was not a good thing. Everyone panicked. But Su Dimeo killed them without hesitation. After all, that small county was very remote, so it was better to do something big. So he pretended to be Zheng Daozhao and went to the post with his official seal. His original plan was to find out the situation of the county treasury in the county, then open the door at night and rob the county treasury clean. Who knew that on that day, as soon as he stepped into the government office, someone would cry out for injustice. He was very brave and had studied before. When he was in the mood, he really went to court to investigate the case. He had been a bandit for many years, so he naturally had a sharp aura. Besides, he had indeed studied before, so he judged the case in a straightforward and fair manner. He was called the Lord of Heaven. In his early years, he had been looking forward to becoming an official. Now that he had become an official, wouldn't he be satisfied? So he decided to play for a day and deal with the official business the next day. He might as well try all the accumulated cases in the government office one by one. Some of the accumulated cases were due to the negligence of the predecessors. Most of them were due to the scoundrels and ruffians, so it was really hard to judge. However, Su Dimeo had already killed dozens of people. Why would he be afraid of these hooligans? How could he not know their methods? Within one day, he cleaned up all the cases. So, the people in the county knew that God had opened his eyes, and a Lord of Heaven had come. And so until the next day, Su Dimeo became more and more proud, and decided to deal with the official business on the third day. In the end, the more he played, the more addicted he became. In the end, he couldn't bear to give up the feeling of making decisions for the people, being respected and respected. But at this time, his former bandit companions came to urge him. Evil thoughts rose in his mind, and he came up with another plan. He released the news, and asked his companions to come at a certain time. And he brought the constables axes, bows and arrows, and secretly set up an ambush. When the time came and the bandits really came, what greeted them was not the wide open door of the county warehouse, but a storm of sharp arrows and shiny swords and spears. Not a single person was left alive. They were all killed on the spot. Su Dimeo had been in the stronghold and killed everyone who had seen him. Now that he silenced these bandits, who would still know who he was? Moreover, there were many people in the vicinity who had suffered at the hands of these bandits. Now that they knew that the new county magistrate was excellent in both literature and martial arts, his reputation quickly spread. Next, he relied on his own abilities to be transferred from this small county to a big county. He did well in the big county, had a good resume, and was promoted to magistrate. In the end, he even had the opportunity to meet with the emperor and become Huzhou's magistrate. And so, after a full 20 years, someone accidentally recognized him and was questioned by his political enemies. Finally, a case occurred. This case caused a stir at the time and reached all the way to the heavens. At that time, the Qing emperor had checked Su Dimeo's resume and found that in his 25 years in office, he could be said to be honest and upright. He was a model among officials. Furthermore, hundreds of thousands of people and gentry under his rule had jointly written a petition to ask for mercy for him. In the end, the emperor sighed and praised him as virtuous and beheaded him. According to Qing law, killing an official and assuming his position should be punished with death by 1,000 cuts and 3 days. This kind of thing was not only in the Qing kingdom, other countries also occasionally heard of it, and it had been around since ancient times. Otherwise, where did the killing an official and assuming his position in Qing law come from? The thoughts of the fake saints were probably the same as those bold secular people. Chapter 459. Some things that didn't belong to them had been held in their hands for a long time, and they had developed feelings for them. They regarded them as their own. And since it was their own, they naturally didn't want to see it destroyed by others. It was just that those officials held power, wealth, and a sense of achievement that was praised by others. And now, these two false saints held the world in their hands. Su Yusong said these words, but Su Sheng opened his eyes. He stared coldly at Su Yusong for a while, and then looked at Li Yunxin. For the world? Humph. You're just a wandering soul. Do you really know what the world needs? Su Yusong also sneered. In short, what the world needs is not the immortals, who don't care about worldly affairs in your Daotong Kenzo. It's ridiculous that for tens of thousands of years, there have been thousands, or even tens of thousands of powerful cultivators, but they only thought about their own cultivation and never paid attention to the common people of the world. Such a profound sect, the world doesn't need it. As for you, didn't you also escape and cultivate lust again? Our cultivation method doesn't require you to abandon your feelings and desires. Now you've also embarked on the same path. It's time for you to wake up and realize that you've done wrong in the past. He was originally interrogating Li Yunxin, but now, Su Sheng only said one sentence, and Su Yusong's emotions became a little agitated. It could be seen that the former saints still left an unerasable mark in the hearts of these two wandering souls. In fact, it was very much like two children eager for recognition. Thoughts like, I'm doing what you did in the past. Let's see if I can do better than you. But in essence, it was also because of another reason. The two wandering souls seemed to know that their saints weren't righteous. But that was the past, and there was no way to change it. They could only make themselves do better than the previous saints, in order to comfort themselves in their hearts, and add more natural rationality to their current saints. And Su Sheng seemed to know that he absolutely couldn't escape, so he gave up on Li Yunxin. So he talked more. He laughed again, and his laughter was extremely contemptuous. Then you two wandering souls, what do you want to do? You want everyone to practice your method, and then cultivate a bunch of monsters with remarkable abilities? Haha, you'll know what that kind of person is like just by looking at him. He shouted sternly, but his eyes were fixed on Li Yunxin. You have great ability, but you also have great desire. People in the secular world also have desires, but no matter how strong the desires of the people are, they also know that there is still Daotong, the grotto heaven, and the two sages. Su Sheng's voice became high-pitched. Ever since Li Yunxin met him, he had never heard him speak so harshly and agitatedly. The pinnacle of worldly power is imperial power. Other than the Daotong Kenzo, there are also the imperial court, the people, and the longevity of the emperor. Why do you think no emperor has been able to pry into the way of heaven in the past 50,000 years? But according to your method, what kind of monster will you create? They had a long lifespan, boundless desires, and even greater power. Don't you know what kind of disaster these people will cause in the secular world? Don't you know what kind of existence demons are? Su Yusong's expression changed. He opened his mouth to speak, but Su Sheng interrupted him again. He really shut his mouth. It was as if it was not Su Sheng who was fixed here and being coerced, but himself. I know what you want to say. Su Sheng looked at him sternly. Li Yunxin also looked at Su Yusong. Then he was surprised to find that Su Yusong's eyes flickered. Although it was only for a very short moment, he was still panicked by Su Sheng's stern eyes and subconsciously looked away. But the next moment, he remembered that he was now a sage, and the person in front of him was just a prisoner. So he looked back. He indeed looked like a child facing a strict father. You want to say that cultivators also kill people, right? Su Sheng stared at him. Cultivators burned down a city in the city of Wei, and killed hundreds of thousands of people, right? But think about it carefully. Are they killing people for a specific purpose? Or are they just killing people because they are in a bad mood? The Daughter of the Golden Rock by Yunxin has been in the world for 1,000 years. How many people has this female demon killed? A few days ago, she killed people on a long street in the city of Little Rock. It was just a casual game for her. Before that, in these years, because she was unhappy, offended and teased, how many cities did she slaughter? Don't you know? Today's Xianmen cultivators, although they are not merciful, they still have the first commandment of do not take the lives of mortals lightly. Just like in the dirty world, although the strong are respected, there are still some benevolence, righteousness and morality on the surface, so that people will not be completely messed up. If according to your previous idea, cultivators will no longer be heartless and abandon their desires, and let them throw themselves into the mortal world, do you know how terrible the world will be? Is this what you said that people in the world want? Su Yusong suddenly shouted. Shut up. Old man, how many times have you said this? Don't you get tired of saying it? Even if the world is in chaos, it is better than the current lifeless and unrighteous state. Great destruction can lead to great success. Great destruction can lead to great success. Great destruction can lead to great success. He seemed to have gone crazy, completely losing his calm and steady demeanor. With a wave of his big sleeve, a bright arc of light hit Su Sheng's body with a buzz. For a moment, the room was as bright as day. Even the sundries nearby were blown away by an invisible force, making a tinkling sound. Su Sheng's body was immediately entangled by electric snakes, and a burnt smell instantly spread. But it was only for a moment, because Zhuo Muzha immediately shouted, "Are you going to kill him now?" Only then did Su Yusong realize that he was not facing a cultivator, nor a big demon, but a reincarnation of a master of calligrapher. Although he could borrow supernatural powers, his ability was limited. So he quickly stopped. But it was too late. Su Sheng's face was beyond recognition, and his clothes were all destroyed. Large pieces of skin and flesh were rolled up on the surface of his body, and even some of the open wounds were still emitting green smoke. He breathed more than he breathed in, and it seemed that he would die soon. Zhuo Muzha frowned and sighed. Alas! You are now a sage. Why can't you bear his anger? Forget it, let's search his soul. After saying this, he touched his sleeve and took out a small sword. However, This small sword made Li Yunxin let out a soft gasp of surprise. He had seen many flying swords of cultivators, but in general, there was nothing too special about their appearance. Some were filled with the aura of treasures, while others were simple and unadorned. But one could tell that they were not ordinary but divine weapons. However, Zhuomu's sword was too strange. It was a rusted sword, the length of a palm, and the thickness of a finger. The whole body was yellowish-brown and uneven. Not only was it rusted, but it seemed to have been rusted for a long time. If this kind of thing was thrown on the roadside in the market, no one would look at it except for children, but it was in the hands of the sword master. As soon as this sword was used, it combined the key of the sword spell. But Su Yusong immediately stopped her. "Wait! You can't kill him now." After saying this, he strode forward and pried open Su Sheng's mouth. With a golden light on his fingertips, he stuffed something into Su Sheng's mouth and hit his chin hard. It seemed that the thing fell into his stomach. Zhuomu frowned. "You gave him the resurrection pill. Do you think this is an ordinary pill? He will die after all." The name resurrection pill was really tacky, but the sword master said it in such a tone, which showed that it was very precious. It was really magical. As soon as the pill fell into his stomach, the wound on his body immediately healed. Li Yunxin was 5 steps away from him, but he could still feel the surging spiritual power. After another 3 or 4 breaths, Su Sheng took a deep breath. He was really pulled back from the edge of death by this pill. Su Yusong snorted and let go of his face. "It's not so easy to die." I want to hear what else he has to say. After escaping from Cloud Mountain for 1,000 years, does he have other knowledge? If he wants to die, I want him to die convincingly. After saying this, he was no longer in the mood to play the game of guessing with Li Yunxin. He turned to look at him with the remaining power. "As for you, now I only want to ask you one thing. If you answer, you will not die for the time being. If not, you will die on the spot." Li Yunxin took a deep breath. "You want to ask me how I became this dragon son?" Su Yusong shouted. "Say it." Li Yunxin sighed, "Possession." After saying these 2 words, he looked up at Su Yusong. Su Yusong was still staring at him sternly, when Li Yunxin's heart skipped a beat. Thinking that these 2 pseudo-sages might also not be able to hear the information related to the word possession, Su Yusong said in a low voice, "How?" Li Yunxin's heart sank slightly, so he sighed again. "I was just lucky. I took Dragon 9's body." After saying this, he looked at Su Yusong's expression again. However, there was nothing unusual. He was still frowning, with a straight face, and wanted to continue listening. So he realized that it seemed that Lu Ling did not tell the details of that night in detail. He had already known that Lu Ling was taken away by the Freemasonry. Su Yusong said that they knew his arrangement in the city of Wei, which should be due to Lu Ling's contribution. She must have told the Freemasonry what had happened in the city of Wei, and then the Freemasonry followed the clues and found out his arrangement. After the city of Wei was burned down, he had chased and fought with the 9th young master, who possessed hatred on the night when Shinryu came to Dongting. Along the way, almost all the runes he had engraved in the city were destroyed. He thought that no one in the world could understand them, but he underestimated the power of the Freemasonry. It seemed that some experts had deduced most of his means from the remaining traces. However, they knew all the arrangements, but there was one thing they couldn't know. To possess Dragon Sun, one must know the concept of emptiness first. In fact, if one dared to try, it was very easy to find out. But the problem was that those who had the ability to kill Dragon Sun, and had the ability to try, would not do this, to try with their lives. This was the key. Li Yunxin could say a lot of things, but if he said this, the Freemasonry who wanted to keep him alive might also want to kill him. Chapter 460. Although the Freemasons' wandering souls could also take over someone's body, it was fundamentally different from what Li Yunxin learned from Bai Yanjun. The Freemasons' possession was to take over a body, according to Li Yunxin's observation, and what Su Sheng had said before. For example, the wandering soul who took over the bodies of the 2 sages could not fully exert the power of this body. It was just wearing a piece of clothing. However, when he took over Long Jio's body, he filled his soul into the emptiness of Qi Wen on the basis of Long Jio's death. This was something similar to the position of a god. Only dragons had it in the whole world, and they could be counted with 2 hands. After the possession, he would have all the power that Long Sun should have, and he would have the strongest body in the world in the same realm. The 2 wandering souls of the Freemasons said something about the 6 desires reincarnation. Didn't they just want to have a body of their own? Once they knew this secret, how could they let him occupy the emptiness of Qi Wen? So he said take over Long Jio's body. And Su Yusong didn't seem to have any objection to this. This meant that for some reason, Lu Ling didn't tell the details of that night. After Li Yunxin killed Long Jio, the 9th young master's body disappeared, and there was no body for him to take over. So they didn't ask in detail. Or did Lu Ling return a favor because Li Yunxin saved her from Dongting? But in any case, Li Yunxin wanted to continue. He paused slightly. At that time, I had no way out. Long Jio pestered me. That demon couldn't be reasoned with. When he was happy, he could tease me, but when he was angry, he would hit me until I vomited blood. Being with him was like being with a tiger. I was always on the edge of life and death. Unfortunately, Lu Ling came to the city of Wei and forced me. Compared to now, the situation at that time was more dangerous. I couldn't reason with Long Jio. I can reason with Lu Ling, but I don't have the capital to do so. Thus, I thought, rather than being killed by them, I might as well give it my all. Li Yunxin squinted his eyes, as if he was immersed in the pleasure of the success of his previous scheme. Of course I know the method of possession. There were such methods in the painting Tao. For example, turning the void into reality, drawing a body out of thin air. In the past, I used this method to create the body of the 3 flowers that I was sitting on. Therefore, I set up an array to ensure that my divine soul wouldn't be lost. He also provoked a fight between Long Jio and Lu Ling. The best case scenario would be for Long Jio to die, and for me to take over his body. The worst case scenario is that Lu Ling dies, and I take her body. Although she's a woman, her aptitude is excellent and she's a good choice. In the worst case scenario, both of them would perish together, leaving nothing behind in this world. Then, I can only possess a random person and wait for the right time. He paused and exhaled softly. But in the end it was the best result. Su Yusong and Zhuomuja kept staring at him without any change on their faces. Although Su Sheng was alive, he was still in a coma. Su Sheng didn't speak, so Su Yusong became a calm and steady person again. After Li Yunxin finished his words, Su Yusong paced around in silence, as if he was trying to figure out whether what he said was true or not. Or, the possession that Li Yunxin mentioned was actually something that wandering souls like them could do. So he was slightly disappointed. He was disappointed, but also slightly suspicious. After a dozen breaths, Su Yusong suddenly turned to look at him. You possessed Long Jio, and with the power of wish, you achieved the true state with this demon's body. Then the previous arrangement in the wild forest was even bigger. You must want to advance another level. This time, who are you going to possess? Li Yunxin answered without hesitation. Besides me, there's another Long Sun who is in the true state. 7 Long Suns are in the mysterious state, and they can also practice the way of demons. Any one of the 8 of them can do it. That's why I came up to Cloud Mountain, to make sure that you know the intentions of Long Sun, and that you can kill them. Su Yusong shouted again. Make sure? How can you be sure that we are going to kill Long Sun? Li Yunxin smiled. Of course I'm sure. And I believe that in your original plan, killing one or a few Long Sun occupied an important position. In the past, demons and Xianmen lived in harmony because they didn't want to start a full-scale war. Now that the full-scale war has begun, for the wandering souls of the Freemasonry, what other body could be better than the body of dragons? Since you like to live by possession, you will certainly not waste a great resource like Long Sun. You will certainly find a way to kill them and leave their bodies intact. Go through, just like me in the past. And I just need to seize the opportunity and a little bit of courage. Su Yusong and Zhuomuja looked at each other. Then Zhuomuja said, So, how are you going to make sure that we can kill Long Sun? Li Yunqin's face showed a little joy. Zhuomu's question seemed to mean that they agreed with his statement to a certain extent. It also meant that things were developing in a good direction. So he immediately answered, "Dragons have a secret. The dragon soul is immortal. The soul of Dragon 9, who was killed by me before, was attached to Hatred's body. However, this kind of coexistence can't last long. As time passes, the guest will be assimilated and absorbed by the master. Therefore, the plan of Zither Lady and Hatred is actually similar to yours. In this war, they will consume as many demon soldiers and demon generals as possible, and then use the great formation they set up to turn those dead souls into the power of will, which they can enjoy alone. Dragons don't care about other demons, and only regard them as sacrifices that can be sacrificed. Therefore, even if they are defeated in the war, they can still have the cultivation of the peak of the profound realm, and even kill a few brothers and sisters, and concentrate the dragon soul on 1 or 2 people. And then it is possible to use the body of a demon to break through the realm of supreme indifference. You should be clear now. This is an unprecedented war. In fact, except for those low-level demons and cultivators of Xianmen, who don't know the truth, the rest of the leaders among the forces, none of them really care about the outcome of this war. What they want is either the dead souls, or the collapse of the Xianmen. This war between the Xianmen and the demons is actually just a piece of meat pie, the flesh and blood of those demons and cultivators. Those demons and cultivators used to treat the people of the secular world as pigs and dogs and blood food. Until now, how can they think that they have become blood food for others? After saying this, he looked at Su Yusong. I have told you everything. You should know that I am sincere. There are still 8 long sun. You can take over any one of them. But you should keep me. It only took me a few months to go from the peak of the transcendent stage to the advanced perfected stage. Whether you admit it or not, there is no one else in the society who can match me in wisdom and courage, except for the 2 of you. And you already have the body of the supreme sage, and my dragon body is useless. In front of you, you also have 2 choices: kill me to ensure your safety, and get rid of a considerable fighting force. Or, take out your courage and gamble whether I am sincere, so that in the future war, whether with the Xianmen or with the elders, you have a better chance of winning. Su Yusong's expression still did not change, but he still remained silent. But Zhuomuja smiled, threw away the book in his hand and stood up. Courage? People like you do not need us to show any courage. After saying this, he took 3 steps and went out of the door. Li Yunqin only looked at Su Yusong. The fake sage was silent for a moment, and then shook his head. You are a heaven-sent genius, and also a double-edged sword. But indeed, it is not enough for me to show any courage. Su Yusong looked at Li Yunqin. Guqin Jun planted a restriction on you and said, if you do not return in 10 days, you will die. In that case, your life will be handed over to the restriction. Su Yusong flicked his sleeve, and Su Sheng and the scattered objects and magic treasures on the table were all collected by him. Then he turned and went out. From tomorrow on, a day in Mount Shaoyan is a day in the world. You still have 12 days. If you can think of a way to break his restriction and live, I will let you live. If you can't think of a way, it will be your life. The world is dangerous, and not everything is under your control. Now have a taste of what it feels like to be a victim of your own cleverness. Li Yunqin was stunned, and then his eyes widened, and he shouted in disbelief. You want me to die here? Are you crazy? Do you think you can fight against the Xianmen, the elders, and the demons with the wandering souls in your hands? You will regret it. But no one answered him. He wanted to rush out of the door and chase after them, but an invisible restriction stopped him in front of the door, and he could not take half a step out. Then, he saw a touch of white in the night sky in the distance. The day of Mount Shaoyan had begun. It also meant that the first day of the remaining 12 days had begun. It also meant that he only had 12 days left to live. If he really could not find a way out. Li Yunqin stared at the gradually brightening sky and shouted again. You will regret it. His voice echoed in the courtyard in front of the house and soon disappeared. Li Yunxin took a deep breath, and after a long time, he slowly exhaled and turned his head to look at the painting music in the cool palace on the white wall. As expected, the painting was covered with a layer of golden light, which kept flowing, as if it was also sealed. The house had become a cage, and he was imprisoned in it. He stood in front of the house for a long time, and then moved to try the other windows. The result was exactly the same as he expected. Su Yusong did not make any mistakes, and the doors and windows were all unbreakable. Therefore, Li Yunxin clenched her teeth and punched the window frame. She lowered her voice and squeezed out the words from between her teeth. Son of AB *TCH. Why aren't you coming out to save me at this time? What the hell is he doing underground? You're tuning in to the Li Mei's Sword of Destiny YouTube channel. We're so grateful for your support. And don't forget to subscribe to join us on this incredible journey through captivating stories. Your generosity through donations truly makes a world of difference, as it's the primary source of revenue that allows me to expand and enhance this channel for you. Thank you from the bottom of my heart for being a part of this adventure.